Testing 1, 2. Is the sound working on here?
Yes, sir. Working just fine.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Just checking my sound as well. Did you hear me, please?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Thank you very much.
This is
Thank
Grace
you.
Napolitano. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Very clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Grace.
Oh, how you doing?
Well, as you can be, it's having fun now, aren't we?
I'm working more from home than I am in Washington.
Yeah. Well, people think, when we're not actually physically there, that somehow we're on vacation time. I find it to be pretty, interesting mentality. But yeah, it's kind of funny.
Yeah, it gives you a better appreciation of what goes on in Washington.
I think everyone should spend a couple of days with us, but at least they should do more to let people know what a day in our existence is. But good to see you. I'm glad you're doing well.
Are you staying fit and well?
I'm trying. Thank you.
I heard Marcy Captor's brother passed away, which is sad news.
Oh, I didn't hear that. I saw her last night on TV at the debates. I didn't hear her brother passed away.
Well, yeah, I just heard that today, so I won't pass the word on.
Please
Have a good day. We'll talk to you later.
Take care.
Audio test 1, 2, 3, 4, 2167 Rayburn. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Coming through loud and clear, Larry.
All right, thank you.
Still be the same number of DPCC positions.
Albio series.
Don Payne. Haven't
How are
seen you,
you?
pal.
How you doing?
What's going on?
Nothing
You all right
much.
at Newark?
Yeah, doing okay, thanks.
Good.
How about you?
Yeah, everything all right in Hudson.
Good, good. How's the missus?
The missus went to Florida. She
She's
abandoned me
okay.
again.
Lucky lady. Smart lady.
Yeah.
That's good.
Hey, guys,
Oh, you're
you're broadcasting. I mean, if you want to do that,
Oh,
that's
so-
okay, but
Sorry.
We started broadcasting already?
And I'm Jim Shudo. Former Vice President Joe Biden says to speak any moment after Boeing tried and debate last night. We'll bring you those comments live. First, though, let's take stock of comments made and not made by the sitting president of the United States to tens of millions of American voters. Last night, the president attacked once again without basis the integrity of the election, even as voters are already casting their votes, and refused once again to pledge to accept the results.
The core hasn't started yet. Yeah, I know, just in case, like, if there's, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
We're getting an amazing soundtrack on this channel.
Committee on Transportation Infrastructure will come to order. I asked if I could forego reading all of the materials about virtual hearings, but I'm told the rules require it. So I will run through as quickly as I can. I call the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to order pursuant to Committee Rule 5F, House Rule 11, 2H4. The chair may postpone further proceedings today on any question approving any measure or adopting any amendment on which recorded vote or the ayes and nays are ordered. And without objection, chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today, committee will consider HR 8408, Aircraft Certification Reform Accountability Act, HR 8266, FEMA Assistance Relief Act of 2020, HR 4358, Preliminary Damage Assessment Improvement Act of 2019, HR 8326, Child Care is Economic Development Act of 2020, HR 4611, Ocean Pollution Reduction Act 2, HR 5919, National Children's Museum Act, and General Services Administration Capital Investment Leasing Program resolutions. Before proceeding further, I'd first like to make a few comments about how we intend to proceed today. We covered these issues during our previous two markups, but I want to briefly remind members of them for this markup as well. It's not brief. Today's markup is being held in the committee's hearing room as well remotely via the fabulous Cisco WebEx. For members and staff in the hearing room, I do have an announcement based on guidance from the Office of Attending Physician dated June 16, 2020. Members and staff, all others physically present in this room are informed that in accordance with recent guidance from the Office of Attending Physician, masks must be worn at all times during today's proceedings, except when a member is speaking at a microphone. The chair views this as a safety issue and therefore an important matter of order and decorum, and he will assert his responsibility to preserve order and decorum in respect to the wearing of masks. The chair's authority to enforce preservation order and decorum committee proceedings derives from Speaker's enforcement authority under Clause 2, Rule 1. Pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 11, the rules of the House are the rules of this committee and subcommittees as far as applicable, and committee chairs have long been responsible for the enforcement of general decorum on their respective committees. The chair would greatly prefer that all present simply uphold the decorum of the committee by complying with reasonable safety standards as recommended by the attending physician and are respectful of all the occupants of the room. However, failing that, enforcement could include the denial of recognition toward members who refuse to uphold standards of decorum. For members participating remotely, I want to remind you of key regulations from those committee on rules to ensure this markup goes smoothly. Pursuant to H Rule Res 965 and its associated regulations, members must be visible on screen for purposes of identification during the proceeding. Members must also continue to use the video function of today's SAP software platform, Cisco WebEx. For the remainder of the time, they are attending this markup unless experiencing connectivity issues or other technical problems. Members experiencing any connectivity issues or other technical problems, please inform the committee staff as soon as possible so you can receive assistance. A chat function is available for members on the Cisco WebEx platform for this purpose. Members can also call the committee's main phone line at 202-225-4472 for technical assistance by phone. The chair may declare a recess subject to call the chair at any time it becomes necessary. In order to address the technical difficulties, members must be visible on screen in order to vote and in order to be counted for purposes of establishing a quorum. Please clearly state your name when called upon by the committee's clerk during roll call or quorum call. Members may not participate remotely in any other proceeding that may be occurring simultaneously. It is the responsibility of each member seeking recognition to do so verbally, hence unmute their microphone prior to speaking to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I request every member keep their microphone muted when not seeking recognition to speak. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request the member please mute their microphone. All materials related to this markup, such as the bills we are considering and filed amendments, have been made available electronically on the committee's website or via email to member staff. Finally, despite this markup being concluded in part remotely, I want to emphasize that all standard rules of decorum apply. As the chair of today's markup, I will make a good faith effort to provide every member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to participate fully in the proceedings. This markup is also being live streamed for public view. Let me say the chair intends to provide every member the chance to participate fully, recognize when seeking recognition. I'll afford reasonable latitude to remote members who are seeking recognition to offer amendments, raise points of order, make parliamentary inquiries, undertake other procedure when timeliness is a factor. I want to assure members that the procedural rights of all members will be protected. I hope all of us will be patient, exhibit our usual level of comedy if we must work through any technical issues together. Okay. The first item, out of the way. First item for consideration is HR H408, the Aircraft Certification Reform and Accountability Act. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Aviation is discharged from further consideration of HR 8408, and I call up the bill for consideration. Hearing none. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Hearing none. I now recognize myself for a statement on HR 8408. I'm pleased today to bring up 8408, the Aircraft Certification Reform and Accountability Act, together with Ranking Member Sam Graves, Aviation Subcommittee Chair Larson, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Garrett Graves. Aviation safety should never be partisan, and this bill demonstrates that once again, Democrats and Republicans on this committee can come together and advance landmark legislation that will make air travel safer. We're here today because of 2 Boeing 737 MAX crashes in the span of 5 months, 2018, 2019, that together took the lives of 346 fathers and mothers, sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters. Those crashes were the inevitable culmination of stunning acts and omissions within Boeing and the Federal Aviation Administration. A chain of events were set in motion as early as 2011 when Boeing decided to re-engine a 1960-era airplane for the third time. Those acts and omissions have been laid bare in numerous investigations and reviews in response to the accidents, including a National Transportation Safety Board safety recommendations report last year, a review by the U.S.-led international panel led by the Joint Authorities Technical Review, JATR, a separate review by a panel of current and former U.S. aviation leaders, incredible investigative journalism, which underscores the value of free and fair press, and of course, an 18-month-long investigation by this committee's Democratic staff, the most extensive investigation in the more than 200 years history of this committee, which resulted in a nearly 250-page report that Chair Larson and I released earlier this month. Taken together, all of these reviews paint a picture of corporate greed, willful and negligent blindness to basic precepts of aviation safety, and perhaps most insidious, regulatory capture on the part of the FAA. In fact, after the first crash, both Boeing and the FAA insisted Boeing was compliant with the federal aviation regulations and its design of MCAS and the information it shared with the FAA. But MCAS had just caused one accident and would cause a second within months. If following the process led to certification of an unsafe airplane, then the process isn't broken and we must fix it. I do remember the head of safety, so-called, at FAA came in to see me in February after the first crash and told me this was a one-off. It wouldn't happen again. Yet his own agency had produced a document called a TARIM, which predicted over the life of this fleet, 15 of these planes would go down. No other aircraft in the history of the United States of America aviation industry has been allowed to fly with predictions that you're going to lose 15 of the fleet because of a system that was installed to deal with aerodynamic instability. That single, and it all came down to a single point of failure, a tiny little vein that sticks out either side of the nose. When one went defective or perhaps broke off, in the case of the Egyptian Air, triggered a cacophony of competing cautions and warnings of flight deck, including stick shaker that erroneously warned the pilots of a stall. It caused the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system, or MCAS, to activate and repeatedly force the airplane's nose down to an extent that few, if any, pilots could counteract. Boeing assumed in the design process that pilots would recognize erroneous MCAS activation and perform the procedure to take the system offline in 4 seconds. I'd invite my colleagues to imagine yourself in an airliner cockpit in flight. You don't know the system exists. And now add in the jarring stick shaker. It's pounding in your hands to tell you you're in a stall, even though you're pretty sure you aren't. A flag on your flight instruments that your airspeed and altitude readings are unreliable. Numerous warning lights, klaxon horns suddenly around the deck. And on top of this all, an unforeseen force, not in the manual, pushing the nose of your airplane down toward the earth, even as you pull with all your might to right the ship. And now you count to 4, 3, 2, 1. Boeing assumed that by now you'd have diagnosed the situation, performed the procedure to properly shut down the system. Sully Sullenberger flew a simulator through this. He knew it was coming. And he said it was very, very difficult to deal with. The man who flew the Miracle on the Hudson, a 50-year pilot. I would challenge anyone to sort through that blizzard of alerts in 4 seconds, determine what's going on, apply the proper procedure. Boeing test in a simulator in 2012 couldn't. As the committee staff investigation revealed, the pilot took more than 10 seconds to respond correctly and found the condition would be catastrophic, meaning the plane would have crashed. Our investigation and others have revealed furthermore that Boeing concealed, or in the most charitable description, failed to disclose important information about MCAS from the FAA, airlines, and pilots. Boeing removed references to MCAS from the pilots' operating manuals, even though they were supposed to respond correctly to erroneous MCAS activation within 4 seconds. FAA never reviewed a consolidated, holistic assessment of the airplane level effects of the angle of attack sensor failure and resulting MCAS activation. Had FAA officials done that, surely they would have asked the questions that would have exposed the danger Boeing had designed into the system. Not that there wasn't plenty of opportunity within Boeing to stop and think about MCAS and the hazardous situations it could create. At one juncture, a Boeing employee who was authorized by the FAA as part of the FAA's ODA program to determine the design's compliance with FAA requirements asked in an email if the airplane was vulnerable to a single angle of attack sensor failure, a safety critical system that would be triggered by a single point, a single point. We don't fly planes like that. The employee was given a summary assurance MCAS was not vulnerable, but that assurance was wrong. The eyes and ears of the FAA on the ground at Boeing had left the FAA largely in the dark, as well regarding issues that affected the airplane certification. Our investigation uncovered innumerable instances of similar missed opportunities. The culture of profits at any cost within the company. The CEO was constantly bragging about the bonuses and the stock performance may well have been a factor in the failure to root out the safety problems. According to a 2016 internal survey of similar Boeing employees, who at the time were called authorized representatives of the FAA administrator, 39% said they felt undue pressure from Boeing management to make those decisions in the company's interest. And that pressure didn't start at lower levels of management. It came right from the top, from the boardroom, from the CEO. And there was the FAA, whose complacency rendered the agency virtually a non-presence in this story until then acting administrator Elwell grounded the airplane after the second one went in, only after numerous other nations had already done so. The FAA was either unable or unwilling to conduct rigorous oversight of Boeing during the certification process. A Boeing employee wrote in an internal email in 2015 that during a presentation on the 737 MAX, FAA officials were like dogs watching TV. But here's the most outrageous indication of a broken safety culture within the very agency that's supposed to be the leading champion of strong safety cultures. In a recent survey, FAA aviation safety employees, 56% of those involved in certification activities believed there was too much external influence on the agency, and that influence was affecting FAA's safety decisions nearly 25 years after I removed the agency's dual mandate to promote and regulate the industry after the disastrous Value Air crash. All of those factors and more, all part of a broken system that broke the public's trust, culminated in 2018, 2019 MAX accidents. The bill we're considering today will fix the broken system. Requires the FAA to approve authorized representatives at all aviation manufacturers by examining both their qualifications and character, so that then when they are considering a proposed design, they will remember that public safety rests on their shoulders. And any person who interferes with an authorized representative's performance of his or her critical duties on behalf of the FAA will be subject to a civil penalty going forward. The bill also imposes civil penalties for a manufacturer's failure to disclose the details of systems like MCAS that manipulate flight controls without direct pilot input and for manufacturer's delivery of an airplane that does not comply with the FAA-approved design. The bill requires 2 FAA rulemakings that together will require manufacturers to provide the agency with thorough assessments measuring the risk created by changes to existing aircraft designs so the FAA can ascertain whether a manufacturer has sufficiently minimized any given risk. The bill requires the FAA to hire more staff to rigorously review new designs, authorizes enough funding to hire 100. It also requires the FAA to implement a non-punitive voluntary safety reporting program for FAA employees to report safety concerns, prohibits agency officials from talking with manufacturers about formal objections to FAA career employees' decisions, unless publicly disclosing the information about those communications, and extends to manufacturers' employees the same whistleblower protections that apply to airline employees today, and much more. To the families of the victims of Lion Air Flight 610, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, thank you. Thank you for the hearings. Thank you for your contacts to members of Congress. Thank you for your perseverance, your advocacy. Your loved one shouldn't have died, but they didn't die in vain because you got the attention of this committee, the Congress, the FAA, the global civil aviation authorities, and we will do whatever it takes to ensure that other families never have to endure that same loss. I thank Ranking Member Graves for his partnership in advancing this important legislation. I look forward to continuing to work with my Republican colleagues on this legislation as we advance the bill to the House floor later this year. And with that, I recognize Ranking Member Graves for his statement.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, and thanks again for working with me to draft this bipartisan bill. After the tragic Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines accidents, it was critical that we took the time to understand all of the factors that contributed to those accidents and the resulting loss of life. A number of expert reviews clearly identified that, unfortunately, mistakes were made. From the beginning, I strongly believe that any potential congressional action must be based purely on nonpartisan views of the incidents and recommendations made by aviation safety experts. We now have the benefit of much of that work, which has confirmed that multiple contributing factors resulted in 2 tragic accidents. The fact remains that the United States can only do so much to influence factors outside our borders, including issues such as pilot training standards of other countries, or how high or low another nation sets the bar for new entrants into this rapidly growing transportation sector. But for us, one fact has to remain constant coming out of this. The United States and the FAA must continue to be the gold standard in aviation innovation and, more importantly, in aviation safety. Our economy, our competitiveness, and hundreds of thousands of American jobs depend on that. Plain and simple, we cannot remain the gold standard if our system isn't safe. One reason for our achievements in aviation is our capacity for self-examination when it comes to safety. And we have always managed to leave partisan policies at the door and work together to fix critical issues to address what went wrong. And I'm proud to say that's what happened in this case as well. The FAA is engaged in what was, and I'm sure at some points, an uncomfortable process of self-analysis and is already making changes identified by expert reviews. I commend the FAA. I commend FAA Administrator Steve Dixon and Deputy Administrator Dan Elwell for the leadership that they have shown in already implementing several important improvements that have been identified by experts. Boeing has also made necessary changes in the way it designs and manufactures aircraft. And our committee is here today to authorize and require additional improvements that are going to make our system even safer. That's what this bill is about. To be clear, safety experts have concluded that we can and should improve the current system. This bill is a good compromise that advances our shared goal of safety, and I'm appreciative that it is based on the recommendations of safety experts. For instance, experts at the Department of Transportation, Special Committee, and the FAA's Joint Authorities Technical Review or JATR, as well as experts from the National Transportation Safety Board, or the NTSB, have issued a number of recommendations related to pilot training, human factors, the international profile of the marketplace, and the need to ensure proficiency in manual flying skills. In response to these recommendations, the bill directs the FAA to independently review pilot training requirements proposed by large aircraft manufacturers. It addresses how manufacturers represent pilot training requirements to customers, and it requires manufacturers to better account for realistic responses to non-normal conditions when designing an aircraft. It also directs a call to action on airman certification standards, and it requires the United States government to exercise leadership in setting global standards to improve air carrier pilot training and qualifications. This is a good, comprehensive, and bipartisan bill that has methodically addressed the contributing factors involved in the 2 tragic accidents and the many expert recommendations to improve aviation safety within our own system. We can only control what we can control, and we've done that here today with this legislation. I support the legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, Rick Larson from Washington State.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio, for holding today's markup on the Aircraft Certification Reform and Accountability Act. Your leadership on this landmark legislation and the partnership of Ranking Member Graves of Missouri and Aviation Subcommittee Ranking Member Graves of Louisiana underscores the importance of this committee's oversight work to ensure aviation safety. On October 29th, 2018 and March 10th, 2019, 346 people tragically died in the Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopia Airlines Flight 302 crashes. The victims were parents, children, teachers, friends, and humanitarians who deserved to arrive safely at their destinations. And for nearly 2 years, while experiencing unthinkable grief, the victims' loved ones tirelessly advocated for necessary reforms to the Federal Aviation Administration's aircraft certification process. Their presence has served as a constant reminder of what is at stake if Congress does not address the systemic safety issues in U.S. aviation. Since the start of the committee's thorough investigation 18 months ago into the design, development, and certification of the Boeing 737 MAX, safety has been our guiding principle. The committee reviewed more than 500,000 pages of documents provided by the FAA, Boeing, and others, held 5 hearings with the administration and stakeholders across the aviation industry and the victims' families, interviewed key employees at Boeing and the FAA, and listened to concerns from several whistleblowers. The committee's thorough investigation uncovered seriously flawed management decisions and inadequate organizational structures at Boeing and the FAA that are difficult to hear about, but they are necessary to confront about the certification process for the 737 MAX. These include Boeing's failure to disclose safety-critical information to the FAA and customers, the FAA's significant lack of oversight, unprecedented production pressures that put profits over people, and combined, these issues eroded safety and contributed to the 2 737 MAX crashes. So Congress does have an obligation to the 346 victims of the 2 crashes and to their families, as well as to the traveling public, to strengthen the FAA's oversight and aircraft certification process and to ensure the safety of air travel. And the Aircraft Certification Reform and Accountability Act is a bipartisan, comprehensive bill to bridge the significant gaps in the current aircraft certification process uncovered by the investigation and uncovered by many others. The legislation will improve safety culture by requiring the FAA to issue rules for the aviation industry manufacturers to adopt safety management systems. It will include an expert review panel to evaluate Boeing's safety culture and to make recommendations for improvements. It will include FAA approval of ODA unit members who work for manufacturers, but on behalf of the FAA to ensure they are qualified and of good character to perform their duties in the public interest of safety. It will also enhance transparency and accountability by requiring, among other things, that manufacturers disclose aircraft safety critical information, particularly related to flight control systems to the FAA and to flight crews. The that the FAA, in collaboration with labor unions, will work to implement a confidential, voluntary reporting program for employees to identify potential safety issues or other concerns. Our legislation will address undue pressure on employees acting on behalf of the FAA within a manufacturer by imposing a civil penalty against the individuals within a company who interfere with an ODA unit member's performance of their FAA-authorized duties, directing the FAA to establish an appeal process for FAA employees to seek elevated review of decisions made regarding a manufacturer's compliance with FAA safety standards with which they dispute as erroneous, and extending whistleblower protections, like those currently afforded to airline employees, to U.S. manufacturing employees. The bill also includes my bipartisan bill with Subcommittee Ranking Member Graves to reinforce human factors, requiring the FAA evaluate tools to integrate human factors into the aircraft certification and flight control systems for transport airplanes, requiring the agency to develop human factors education program for relevant employees and other authorized representatives, and requiring manufacturers to provide the FAA with information and findings on flight crew training to ensure it adequately includes consideration of human factors. In conclusion, the foundation of U.S. aviation is safety. This bill reinforces this foundation to ensure the integrity of the FAA and the U.S. aviation manufacturing industry. The two tragic 737 MAX crashes served as a stark wake-up call about the deficiencies in our certification process, and our legislation makes necessary improvements to address these issues. And I want to thank the majority and minority committee staff for their hard work on this bipartisan legislation as well. I look forward to moving it through to the House floor and encourage its support. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the ranking member of the Aviation Subcommittee, Representative Garrett Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How did we get here today? We got here today because there were two crashes in March and in October of 2018 and March of 2019. We're here today because there were 346 senseless, untimely deaths that occurred. We're here today because one of those includes the daughter, Samuel Rose, of Michael Stumo, who has been relentless in pushing us and holding us accountable to do the right thing here. We've had a grounding that's lasted more than 18 months, the longest in American history. We've held 5 hearings, which has consumed more than half of the, I believe about half of the hearings of the subcommittee. And more than we have ever had on a crash. This issue has dominated the time of this committee and subcommittee, but that is appropriate because we have the gold standard in aviation in terms of the world. But obviously what happened here shows that it's imperfect and we must strive for perfection. We need to focus on safety, on the lessons learned from the tragic accidents, and not go down political rabbit holes. We need to go where the numerous nonpartisan expert reports have taken us, the reviews, where they lead us, including the investigations by the National Transportation Safety Board, the Joint Authorities Technical Review, and the Department of Transportation Special Committee. I've repeatedly said we need to extract every single lesson learned that we can from these accidents in order to improve safety, and I'll say it again, strive for perfection. I've also said when it comes to aviation safety, as Chairman DeFazio, that Chairman Larson and Ranking Member Graves said, we need to set partisan politics aside and come together. Safety is not a partisan issue. And I'm proud to say that's exactly what happened in this bill today. And I want to thank the Chairman, the Ranking Member, and of the committee and subcommittee. Not only have we set partisan posturing aside, but we've produced a comprehensive bill that addresses both the specific recommendations of the nonpartisan expert committees, the expert safety reviews, and the many factors that contribute to these accidents. But nothing is perfect. And I'll tell you, as we continue moving forward, I think we need to make sure that this bill applies to all manufacturers. And we need to make sure, while clearly the casual safety relationship was implicated numerous times in numerous reports and testimony from experts, we also need to make sure that we don't set a bar that actually scares people from reporting. We need to be very thoughtful about that right balance and striking the environment to where safety is paramount and there's no obstacle or threshold to cross in terms of raising safety issues within the system. FAA and Boeing have both taken steps to improve their system, and I do want to thank FAA Administrator Davidson and Deputy Administrator Elwell. There's still going to be lessons learned. Let's be clear, this bill is not it. There's still going to be lessons learned as we move forward, and we need to continue responding to those lessons learned and continue putting remedies and resolutions in place to ensure that this doesn't happen again. The bill does establish the legal framework for how we move forward based on the expert recommendations, the safety management system, better controls over project management, integrated project review teams to ensure that the FAA, different entities know exactly what's going on through the certification process, requiring full disclosure of safety critical information so the FAA and the manufacturers have a common understanding of all aircraft systems, new processes to ensure that the aircraft are produced in compliance and conformance with their type certificate and design, ensuring that renewed focus on novel and unusual design features, including milestone reviews so it doesn't evolve or get amended into something that looks very different than it started, ensuring that human factors are considered in the aircraft design. These and other changes will set the rules for the road ahead. Mr. Chairman, in closing, let me say it again. Safety is not and should never be a partisan issue. And with that, I want to read a message that we received from one of the family members. It says, my family, and I know that this was sent to the committee leadership. My family feels indebted to all the members of the T&I committee for your work in support of this legislation to be marked up Wednesday. We thank Chairman DeFazio, Larson, Ranking Member Sam Graves, and others and their teams for working together to make a big difference. Something's good is going to come out of the crash that killed my family member and 300 others. You ignored, for this purpose, the partisanship of this campaign season to do something special. Mr. Chairman, I can't say it any better than that. I want to thank you. I want to thank Chairman Larson. I want to thank Ranking Member Graves, as well as all the members of the committee who were involved in this process to ensure that we truly come up with a solution to the clear problem that we've seen before us. With that, yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Recognize Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do not have any questions. I just ask for unanimous consent to put my statement in the record. Did you hear me?
Yes, without objection, your statement will be in the record. Sorry, I didn't have the mic on. Okay.
That's okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Eddie B. Now, Representative Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation is in response to the Boeing 737 MAX disasters, and I concur in the need to address the systemic failures that enabled the two airliner crashes. The Boeing 737 MAX airliner crashes were tragic and inflicted pain and suffering on so many family members and friends of the victims. The families rightfully expect from Congress action and changes in the law to prevent the circumstances that led those tragic events. Clearly, there were systemic failures at multiple levels. This bill and the section-by-section analysis was released and distributed to the committee members Monday evening, about 36 hours before this markup. Since I'm well past the stage of a college student cramming for final exams, I've had one business day to review a bill that most agree is fairly technical. One day to review legislation and consider and prepare amendments is clearly designed to prevent any input, any consideration by rank and file members of the committee, and that is both a poor legislative process and disrespectful. We've taken this much time to analyze this. I don't understand why not taking a bit more time to actually look at the legislation. This committee has a long history of both bipartisanship and fully engaging members. A number of members of the committee also sit on armed services, through which we consider on an annual basis the National Defense Authorization Act. The legislation is massive, incredibly complex, is drafted weeks in advance with bipartisan engagement, ample time to provide amendments, and a markup is lengthy. But most would agree the ultimate legislative product that hits the floor is not only bipartisan, but effective legislation, and everyone is heard. And that is something that is undertaken annually for 59 straight years. These changes to the FAA and manufacturer processes to address safety, manufacturer safety processes, type ratings, ensure FAA oversight, training, are not routine or annual. Congress infrequently takes the opportunity to review these matters. So frankly, a one-day time period to consider legislation that addresses these for this markup is absurd. I, like a number of us, rank and file members, have been engaged in the Boeing 737 MAX issues since the initial crashes. Mr. Chairman, you'll recall in a hearing with Boeing, I called for the resignation of the CEO. Because clearly, in my opinion, based on what we've seen so far, he was directly culpable, directly responsible for the actions that led to this. A number of members possess sufficient background, understanding, and have independent access, separate from the committee, to individuals with expertise in this field. However, the process of drafting the bill and moving it to a committee precludes effective engagement and sends a clear message. Committee leadership has decided the steps that they believe are warranted on this issue. They do not care to seek or consider options or opinions of committee members, and in fact, would prefer compliant adherence to a four corners agreement. Simply vote with the committee leadership and move on. While to be direct, I raised sheep on my farm, but I was not elected to behave like one. Americans elect us to represent their interests, concerns, and beliefs. They expect us to fully understand the bills we vote on and engage in the ultimate legislative language. This process does not allow that. I refuse to participate further in this markup. I ask the record to indicate my objection to this closed and truncated legislative process, and further record my refusal to vote, either by voice or recorded, on this bill in committee as a result. I yield back.
Well, I'm sorry the member feels so aggrieved. The investigative report has been available for 2 weeks. It's 250 pages long. If you had read that report in its entirety, you would see that everything in this bill is informed by that report. There are no leaps of conclusions. There are no political manipulation. We conducted the most extensive investigation in history of this committee. Hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, numerous hearings, interviews, and that's what informed this legislation. I'm sorry the gentleman perhaps didn't have a chance over the last 2 weeks to read the 250 pages and then correlate it back to the bill and see it's all based in that, but I regret that, and I recognize that the gentleman wishes to leave.
Does the chairman yield for a moment, please?
No, the gentleman wishes to leave. The gentleman may leave now.
I read the 250 pages, sir. I'm offended that you would suggest I had not. I am literate. Thank you.
Well, sir, sorry you're offended. With that, we turn to Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first acknowledge the great work of Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Sam Graves, and Ranking Member Garrett Graves. The work that you all put in to reach a bipartisan compromise that this committee can really be proud of. You know, in a Washington that has become focused almost exclusively on politics and partisanship, to the detriment of our nation, I hope others take notice of our work here today. Just as Chairman DeFazio talked about, the work that this committee has put in over almost the last 2 years has really been remarkable, and it culminated in this bill here today. From the beginning of the T&I Committee investigation into the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, I said repeatedly that something went terribly wrong in a certification of this plane. and that Congress must do all we can to prevent this from happening again on any plane. The committee's investigation made it clear that Boeing and the FAA rushed to get this plane approved due to financial pressures, and that there were not enough safeguards in the organization designation authorization program to prevent an unwarranted certification. HR 8408, the Aircraft Certification Reform and Accountability Act, is a good bipartisan piece of legislation that addresses problems with the FAA certification process. It addresses many of the issues I raised during the hearings we held on the MAX and in other committee discussions. Those issues include: one, making sure that safety critical systems like the MCAS are clearly disclosed and evaluated by the FAA before a plane is certified to fly. Two, proposing thoughtful reforms to the ODA program to reinforce the FAA's independence and oversight role in ensuring safety. Three, requiring a system-wide safety assessment for proposed design changes under amended type certificates. And four, addressing concerns about the revolving door between industry and FAA by implementing a one-year cooling off period for incoming FAA employees before they can oversee their former employer. Collectively, these reforms will help ensure that the ODA program functions appropriately, that the FAA is free from undue industry influence and is truly an independent regulator, that new technologies like MCAS are properly analyzed for their safety, and that the cultures at Boeing and FAA embody the right values. But our work is not done. We owe it to 346 victims and families of the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines plane crashes to ensure that this bill is enacted into law and the necessary reforms are carried out. I will continue to work with my colleagues on this committee to advance this critical bipartisan legislation and work to do all we can to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Again, I want to thank the chairman, the two ranking members, and everyone on this committee for all the work that you have done. It's a bill we can be proud of. Let's get this done today and move ahead and get this to the president's desk and improve safety for everyone in our country and around the world. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank gentlemen. Representative Series.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I'd like to commend you for all your hard work. I'd like to commend Minority Leader, Ranking Member Graves for the hard work on this bill. And I am proud to support this important legislation that includes essential reforms to the FAA's floor aircraft certification process that led to the two fatal crashes of Boeing 737 MAX aircraft in 2018 and 2019. This legislation comes as a result of the findings in the committee's final report on the investigation into the crashes, which took place within 5 months of each other. I was disgusted when I learned the final report revealed that the withholding of important safety information by Boeing from the FAA's, its customers, and pilots about the angle of attack disagreed. Alerts being inoperable on most of the 737 MAX fleet, despite the system's operational being mandatory on all 737 MAX aircraft. Boeing had multiple opportunities to improve safety, and as the report shows, there is a troubling pattern of misjudgment by Boeing. Ultimately, the finding of the report proved that reform over the certification process is urgently needed, which is why I am proud to support this legislation today. While I am outraged by Boeing's negligence and disregard for human life, I am also hopeful that this legislation fixes these dire failures in the aircraft certification process. And I thank you, Chairman, for this legislation.
I thank gentlemen. And now Vice Chair Carbajal. Salute. Oops, he stepped out. Okay, then we'll go to Representative Brown. Anthony, you still there? Okay, all right. Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a statement. This is Congressman Cohen.
Yeah, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to, in addition, thank everybody that's worked on this legislation. It's so needed. Mr. Mitchell mentioned that he called on the Boeing CEO to be removed. I don't know if that was prior to my doing it or after my doing it, but I do recall him doing that, and I certainly did. I had some rather harsh things to say about Boeing, and I think this report shows that they were all well placed. It is important that government, as a regulatory body, have regulatory powers and enforce them that are independent and transparent and looking out for the public's interest. That didn't happen in this industry, and it doesn't happen in other industries. And we all need to be suspect when people say we don't need regulation and we don't need oversight, because it's important and it's good. So thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member and the Larson, for what you've done. This is an important bill, and it's an important function of Congress to do oversight and to show that we act in the public's interest. And I want to express my regrets again to all the families who've lost loved ones. This is totally regrettable. And I want to say that we owe it a.
You're absolutely.
Their families, they were maligned on when people immediately said it was pilot error. It's a nice way to pick on some non-American, non-Caucasian pilots and say they did it, not Boeing. They did the best they could in a death trap. With that, I thank everybody, and Mr. Alvio Sears, he in his quiet way, he influenced this bill in a major way, and I want to recognize that fact. And I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I don't find LBO to be that quiet. At this point, I would recognize Representative Carbajal, Vice Chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, thank you to you, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Larson, and Ranking Member Graves for taking leadership and putting aside politics to bring forth this important bill that makes reforms to the Federal Aviation Administration Safety Framework in response to the horrible Boeing 737 MAX crashes. I am pleased to see this include a comprehensive set of provisions to overhaul the FAA's review and oversight of manufacturers. Among some of the measures included would be a requirement for manufacturers.
All right, yeah, I'm not using my mic. I had mine off. Someone doesn't have their mic off. We're getting some weird scratching and other sounds, so if you could please be sure you're muted. Thank you. Gentlemen, will resume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Continuing, among some of the measures included would be a requirement for manufacturers to adopt safety management and reporting systems, which the NTSB has highlighted for the positive benefits they can yield. I am also glad to see that we are advancing H.R. 8266, the FEMA Assistance Relief Act of 2020, which I joined as an original co-sponsor. As California continues to fight wildfires and local governments have been cash-strapped due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, this is a critical bipartisan bill that will help local governments continue to respond to these emergencies. The bills we are considering today make significant changes to ensure air safety and provide much-needed resources for our communities. I urge my colleagues to support these bills. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to acknowledge and thank the surviving families of those
lost in the Lion Air and Ethiopian avoidable yet fatal mishaps. I want to thank them for urging Congress to do our part in passing legislation that will reduce, if not eliminate, these types of incidences in the future. I want to acknowledge you, Mr. Chairman, for your hard work, along with Chairman Larson, ranking members Sam Graves and Garrett Graves on this in legislation, a true testament to Congress's ability to work together in a bipartisan way on meaningful legislation. And I certainly voice my full support for the Aircraft Certification Reform and Accountability Act. Over the past year and a half, the committee has held numerous hearings and conducted its own investigation into the design, development, and certification of the 737 MAX. The Airport Certification Reform and Accountability Act makes significant reforms to the FAA's aircraft certification process. It also ensures transparency, accountability, and integrity in FAA regulation of U.S. manufacturers of aircraft parts and components. Safety should always be a bipartisan issue, and I'm grateful that we were able to come to an agreement on this critical legislation. As a former military pilot, what I found to be most important was the information about the aircraft I flew. Whether that be the operating manuals, my quick reference handbook, or pilot training. The committee's Boeing 737 MAX investigation final report shows that in March 2016, hours after Boeing's leadership approved a redesign of MCAS, Boeing then sought and received permission from the FAA to remove any reference to MCAS from its pilot training manuals. I'm pleased to see that the bill requires that aircraft flight manuals and flight crew operating manuals contain a description of such a system and flight crew procedures for responding to a failure or aberrant operation of such a system. The pilots in both 737 MAX accidents were not aware of the MCAS and thus did not know how to properly react to alerts and warnings. Additionally, the final committee's report finds the 737 MAX chief project engineer acknowledged that one of the design objectives of the MAX program was to ensure that the MAX did not require simulator training. I'm pleased to see that the bill requires the FAA to independently review a proposal by a transport airline manufacturer in setting pilot training requirements and prohibits manufacturers from making assurances regarding certain pilot training requirements to customers before the FAA establishes them with a clear disclaimer. It's critical that pilots and flight crew are equipped with the best tools, training, and documentation to ensure the safety of the aircraft during flight. These provisions in this bill will help ensure U.S. manufactured aircraft flown around the globe remain the safest across the world. My heart goes out to the families who lost loved ones in the 737 MAX accidents. My hope is that this legislation will help avoid another catastrophic tragedy. Again, I commend my colleagues for their bipartisan work on this bill, and I strongly encourage each of us to support the proposed legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now, Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. I want to begin by extending my deepest condolences to the families of the 346 people who lost their lives in the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines crashes. Today's markup of the Aircraft Certification Reform and Accountability Act is an important step towards honoring the lives lost and addressing the issues laid bare by various investigations and reports. I commend our committee staff and their partners for their thorough months-long investigation and for producing bipartisan legislation that bridges the regulatory gaps that partly led to the cascading failures that ultimately cost lives and undermine our nation's leadership in global aviation. As an advocate for workers and chair of the Education and Labor Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, I applaud the provisions that enhance pilot training, ensure greater disclosure of safety critical information and expand whistleblower protections. Adoption of this legislation will mark the beginning of a much needed new chapter of oversight of aircraft certification, oversight, and accountability. The traveling public deserves that. The families of loved ones deserve that. I fully support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. Thank you to the committee and all of those who had a part in orchestrating this bill. And I yield.
Thank the gentlelady. Are there other members who wish to be recognized? Since people are remote, I'll give them a moment in case there is someone. I don't see anybody raising their hand, so all right, then we will proceed. Are there any, yes, I know I'm right. Are there any amendments to HR 8408? Give you a moment since some of you are remote. Okay, hearing none. The question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting of HR 8408 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Michael. Sorry. Our next item for consideration is HR 8266, the FEMA Assistance Relief Act of 2020. Without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of HR 8266. And I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I have an amendment in the nature of substitute. The amendment in the nature of substitute has been distributed electronically to members in accordance with the rules. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to HR.
The clerk will suspend for a moment. Someone's unmuted. Thank you. Okay. The clerk will designate.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 8266, offered by Mr. DeFazio, numbered ANS.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered the base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for a statement on HR 8266. HR 8266, the FEMA Assistance Relief Act, is a bipartisan bill I introduced with Subcommittee Chair Titus, Representatives Thompson, Lowy, Roybal, Allard, and dozens of other members representing districts ravaged by natural disasters this year. Simply put, it would increase the federal cost share of certain assistance provided by the Federal Emergency Management Agency under the Stafford Act. Specifically, the bill would adjust the federal cost share for all declared disasters in 2020 from 75% to not less than 90%, and further adjust the federal cost share for COVID-related declarations to 100%. Communities across this country, including my district in Oregon, are reeling from twin or tri-crises, COVID-19 pandemic, the economic distress that has wrought upon the citizens of my district and virtually all Americans, and then record-breaking extreme weather events that triggered massive fires. Just upriver from me, 273,000 acres, and it obliterated the town of Blue River in its entirety and burned hundreds of houses down the river. It was like a blowtorch. We never get winds out of the Northeast. We've never had hurricane force winds out of the Northeast before. Oregon doesn't see 6% humidity, and Oregon used to get snowpack in the wintertime, which helped keep the fuels from being too combustible. So state, local, tribal, and territorial governments are seeing their public health and emergency management resources stretched thin or outright exhausted. It's our responsibility to ensure that they have the financial support necessary to address these crises. I first implored President Trump to direct FEMA to authorize a federal cost share adjustment back in March, and there has yet to be any action. While federal regulations allow for such a presidential or administrative cost share adjustment, we've all seen the requests from the National Governors Association, National Conference, and it's my understanding is that the Governors Association, both DNR, have to be unanimous, so that is all the governors of the United States of America, Democrat and Republican, the National Conference for State Legislatures, the National Association of Counties, NEMA, IAEM, and others, for this much-needed additional assistance at a time when states and locals have seen their revenues crater as a result of the impact of public health measures taken to combat the pandemic. Several times during the last 15 years, Congress has statutorily increased the federal share of FEMA assistance. This year has already seen the busiest tornado, hurricane, and worst wildfire seasons on record. Overlay the burdens of response and recovery to that unprecedented volume of natural disasters atop a global pandemic. And if ever the time was right for another statutory adjustment, this is surely it. Further, by establishing a national emergency and pulling FEMA into the response in mid-March, the President invoked a clause in the Stafford Act, Section 501B, which states the United States exercises exclusive or preeminent responsibility and authority to deal with the hazard. This alone justifies the 100% cost share for COVID-related expenses. This bill would go a long way to help ease the financial burden on state, local, tribal, territorial communities that have been granted Stafford Act declarations this year. Additionally, this legislation clarifies and encourages FEMA to reimburse PPE, disinfection expenses for public schools, public transit, courthouses, and other traditionally eligible non-medical entities, which were conspicuously excluded from eligibility in FEMA's September 1st interim policy on eligible public assistance expenses. I'd like to thank both Congressman Payne and Malinowski for their efforts to address this with a standalone bill. Thanks, guys, and I'm glad we're able to address the matter here. Considering how fervently the President demanded schools be open, the idea this administration would preclude schools from being reimbursed for taking measures to protect children and teachers is beyond me. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and provide additional resources to the communities which we all represent, who are all suffering. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sadly, as I've said before in this committee, all of our districts at one time or another are going to be impacted by a disaster. And currently, the entire country is suffering in many parts from multiple disasters. And Mr. Chair, I know your district's been hit hard by recent wildfires. And I want you to know on behalf of committee Republicans that we hope your constituents in your district are able to recover and get back to normal as quickly as possible. H.R. 8266 adjusts the federal cost share for disasters declared in 2020, included for COVID, which has added another layer to recovery efforts for national disasters occurring simultaneously in parts of the country. This bill also clarifies all of the different types of FEMA assistance available to help our states and communities as they respond to disasters. And I urge my colleagues to support this bill. And with that, I yield back.
I thank gentlemen. I now recognize Representative Titus, Chair of the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management, for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to join you, Chairman DeFazio, as a co-sponsor of this bill, H.R. 8266. On March 24th of this year, in the earliest days of the pandemic, I joined you in calling on the President to waive the 25% cost share requirement. Yet we've seen over the last 6 months that the administration has left the states to battle it out and fend for themselves at nearly every turn. We have not gotten the pandemic under control. over 200,000 people have died. We've lost considerable jobs here, especially in southern Nevada, and we've not made much progress. But today we have an opportunity to right a wrong that could have been addressed months ago. We can pass this bill and help our states, our cities, and our tribal nations and territories deal with the financial burdens brought about by the failures at the federal level. For my home state of Nevada, this will amount to roughly $7 million, which might not be a lot to some states, but this summer, a special session of our legislature had to find $1.2 billion in cuts to deal with our budget shortfalls, since our state has no income tax and relies largely on gaming and sales tax, which were devastated. The majority of the cuts were to health services, K through 12 education, and Medicaid reimbursements. Additionally, this bill clarifies that FEMA should reimburse the cost of PPE and sanitation services related to COVID-19 in order to protect our teachers, our students, and our transit workers who are currently not eligible for the assistance. Getting our country back on track starts with providing our communities with the support they need, especially in these devastating times from COVID, from hurricanes, from the fires, from the unemployment. The communities of every member on this committee have been impacted, as you have heard also from the ranking member, by the disasters that we are facing. So I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. I'm certainly all on board, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I would now go to ranking member of the subcommittee, Representative Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. HR 8266 would raise the federal cost shares for disasters in 2020, including assistance for the COVID-19 response. The bill also clarifies the assistance eligibility for activities related to COVID, including increased costs of governmental operations, testing, food distribution, and personal protective equipment. These changes will help support states and communities in their continued response to COVID and recent disasters. I strongly support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Cires.
I don't have any comments.
Representative Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity. And I'd like to thank you for helping with the Mask for Students Act that Representative Malinowski for co-leading the bill as well. On September 1, the Trump administration announced that FEMA would no longer be reimbursing schools for cloth face coverings. In case anyone isn't aware, there still is an ongoing pandemic, and the president's disaster declaration remains in effect. Across the nation, schools are grappling with the complexities around safe reopening and protecting students and staff from COVID-19. One thing these schools shouldn't have to worry about is paying for masks. It's becoming abundantly clear that masks are an effective means of reducing COVID-19 infections and disease spread from asymptomatic carriers. The legislation I introduced with Representative Malinowski that Chairman DeFazio helped get into the underlying bill ensures that FEMA will be able to reimburse school districts for any cloth face coverings purchased during the ongoing pandemic. This will keep our children and our teachers safe and prevent already stretched education budgets from additional hits. I thank Chairman DeFazio and Congressman Malinowski for their work on this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Payne. Now, Representative Garrett Graves, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first I want to echo the comments made by Ranking Member Sam Graves about your district. I'm very sorry about the impact that the fires are having on all the people that you represent, and I certainly respect the fact that this legislation is an attempt by you to fight for them. I get it. Mr. Chairman, I come from probably the most disaster-impacted state in this country. We have been through so many hurricanes. We've been through the worst environmental disaster. You can be second, Mr. Weber. Probably the worst environmental disaster in our nation's history, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the record high water for the last 5 years coming down the Mississippi River because it's one of the largest watersheds in the world, draining Canada, New York, Montana, and many, many other states. Mr. Chairman, every time we have a disaster, our state, our local governments come to us and ask us to do this. And every single time, I tell them no. And I'll tell you why. I tell them no because I think it's critical that they have skin in the game. They've got to have skin in the game to make sure that liabilities, to make sure that vulnerabilities, that hazards are addressed. By coming in and just funding it all, we're allowing them to be irresponsible. This is a partnership. And under current law, it's a 25% non-federal cost share. Mr. Chairman, when you hit certain conditions under 44 CFR 206.47, you then can go to a 90% cost share, and in some conditions, 100% federal cost share. Mr. Chairman, in this case, and look, there are rare examples of where it's the federal government's fault, and in those cases, yeah, do 100%. But Mr. Chairman, we've got to make sure that everybody's got skin in the game here. I think this legislation goes in the wrong direction. Keep in mind, Mr. Chairman, under CARES and other bills that we've done, 5 different bills so far, we've provided the Coronavirus Relief Fund, hundreds of billions of dollars to states through social services block grants, community development block grants, direct assistance to schools, which I've heard brought up over and over again, and PPE, providing it directly to states. We've provided transit assistance, airport assistance. We've come in and provided stimulus payments directly to individuals. We've done the PPP program. We've done the EIDL loan program. Mr. Chairman, on May 19th, the Treasury told the states that they can use coronavirus relief funds to pay their cost share. So effectively, it is 100%. Look, here's the thing. Every level of government, whether it's the smallest town in America or it's the federal government, you have 3 options. You have 3 options. You either raise taxes, you cut spending, or you incur debt on your children and grandchildren. What this bill does is it just makes it easy for states and locals, and it just says, Fed, you're going to do it all. I've seen some estimates that we've already spent $7 trillion through all the different programs and Federal Reserve efforts. $7 trillion. Mr. Chairman, look, I'll say it again. I respect you and everyone who has worked on this bill, and I understand what you're trying to do. But there's an existing process for how we get to a lower non-federal cost share. It's under the Code of Federal Regulation right now. And we're stepping in and we're making a political decision here, and what otherwise is a process that is in existing regulation. There's a process by which we do it, and I think we ought to rely upon that process. We made some changes in the DARA Act of 2018 to try. In fact, I want to thank Mr. Davis. Looking at the impact of multiple disasters and making sure that cumulative impact is fully considered, Section 1232, if I remember correctly. And I think that FEMA screwed up that interpretation, and maybe that's something we can look at in perfecting that to make sure that we achieve or make it advance the outcome that you're looking for. But I can't say it enough. I think it's a mistake for us to allow the state and local governments to effectively not have any skin in the game here. I think that, it's like the people like Mr. Davis, when he goes into a hotel room, I've heard he sets the AC on 55 degrees because he doesn't pay the bill. And Mr. Larson, I've heard, is irresponsible in handling rental cars because they're not his and he doesn't care. I mean, in this case, we've got to have skin in the game. We've got to have those people care. And yes, I just made those things up. And I just think it's important. And I think this bill is a mistake. I think it's the wrong direction. I think it's a bad precedent. I think it's a political solution. And I really wish we could work within the existing framework. Yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his, as usual, impassioned remarks. I would point out that it's my understanding that Louisiana got 100% after Katrina.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would certainly yield for a very brief statement.
And I will briefly say that, Mr. Chairman, in my comments I said, except in the rare instances where it's the federal government fault, it's fault.
Okay.
Chief of Engineers,
All right.
General Carl Strock, said it was their fault.
Thank the gentleman. Part of Katrina was the fault of what happened with the levees around New Orleans, but a whole lot of other damage in the southern part of the state had nothing to do with that, and that was all waived also. So, and then secondly, we're only going to 100% because of the Section 501B declaration by the president, which is for COVID, and that would be for all jurisdictions in the United States, because under 501B, it says the United States exercises exclusive or preeminent responsibility and authority to deal with the hazard. So that's why we went to 100% with COVID. We went to 90% on these other disasters, 90%, 10%. That's not insignificant. The cost of these wildfires this year was tens of billions of dollars. So there's going to be a very substantial burden on the local jurisdictions and on the insurance industry for those structures that were insured. With that, I would now recognize Representative Carbajal. He's not here. Okay, Representative Stanton. Stanton is, Greg, there he is, yep.
Yep. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership on this important piece of legislation. I'm proud to co-sponsor it because I know it'll make a profound difference for many communities across our country. This pandemic has been difficult for so many, but few have been hit harder than the Navajo Nation. There have been more than 10,000 positive COVID cases on the nation, and tragically, we have lost more than 500 tribal members to this terrible disease. COVID took advantage of the strengths of the Dene people, whose homes are shared by many generations of a single family. They take care of each other, but with a disease like this, tragically, they can get sick together. Navajo leadership responded to this crisis with resilience. President Jonathan Nez and his team listened to the experts, executed a plan, and got it under control. Just last week, Dr. Anthony Fauci praised the Navajo leadership for turning things around. To get there, though, the costs have been great. And many tribal communities, just like the Navajo, need the federal government to step up. There's a simple and easy thing the federal government can do: increase the federal cost share of FEMA public assistance funding for the COVID-related declarations. That would provide much needed relief to communities and tribal nations whose budgets have been stretched thin in response to this unprecedented public health emergency. The Navajo Nation did ask the federal government to provide this assistance more than 5 months ago, but their request has been met with silence from this administration. This administration could make this change on its own. It has the power to do so, but it has failed to act. It has let so many communities down. It's up to us in Congress to get this right. With the additional federal assistance provided by this bill, our communities and tribal nations will be able to focus their resources and other critical response needs to fight this virus. Further, this bill addresses FEMA's recent misguided policy to eliminate reimbursement to schools, election agencies, and other local government entities for the purchase of supplies that are necessary to contain the spread of COVID and protect public health. With this bill, we ensure these necessary supplies like personal protective equipment, barriers, and sanitizing materials purchased by our schools, courthouses, and local government entities and are critical to allow them to function safely and reopen will be properly reimbursed by the federal government. I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Representative Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as we look at what's happening in the West with the devastating wildfires, I'm heartbroken by that. I'm heartbroken that we're seeing our beautiful forests go up in flames. I'm heartbroken that people's lives and homes are being so adversely affected. And there's no question that folks in these areas need help. And in 2018, we, and Chairman, I know you helped work on this, did something called the Fire Funding Fix, where we actually made
FEMA funds available to reimburse the Forest Service for wildfires. But another reason I'm heartbroken is because we're still here talking about this and things aren't getting better when we can do a better job than what we've been doing. As the climate warms, as those fuels become more flammable, we sit back on the sidelines and let them continue to build up. And we know that we're going to have these devastating fires year after year that are costing billions of dollars. Wouldn't it make more sense to spend this money on the front end to help prevent the intensity of these fires, to save people's lives, to save property, to keep insurance rates from going through the roof, to stop having to shut down the electrical power grid during this time of the year? And we know how to do that. I often think about the people that came before us and the wisdom that they had. And if you look at why this country has a Forest Service, it's because as we acquired public land with public rights, the folks who came before us realized that we needed professional land managers to take care of that public estate. That's why the Forest Service was put in place. That's why the BLM was put in place. But over the years, the Forest Service and the BLM have not been able to do their jobs because of the laws that we've put in place here in Congress. We know how to fix those laws, but yet we do not do it. There's plenty of blame to go around on these fires, but I'm not blaming the state of California, the state of Oregon, or Washington. I'm blaming Congress because we've tied the hands of the Forest Service and we refuse to fix the law so they can do their jobs. And Mr. Chairman, the resistance to fix the law, unfortunately, comes from your side of the aisle. We've got sound policies out there that will allow the Forest Service to go in and do their job on federal lands, that will allow the BLM to do their job on federal lands. But every time we try to change those laws, we find out that our lands are actually being managed by lawyers, by activists, and by courts that are stopping all management on the lands. There's no question that there's funds needed to help pay for these disasters that were created by Congress's failure to enact. I just hope that instead of coming back here year after year to do this, we will finally put some common sense laws in place that will allow our professional public land managers to do their job and stop the intensity and the frequency of these catastrophic fires. And I yield back.
I then thank the gentleman. I realize he has tremendous expertise in forestry, and I would point out that back under the Bush administration, actually, we adopted bipartisan legislation. I was on the Resources Committee at the time, called the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And the idea was that we would start in the WUIs, the wildland-urban interface, and then we would work back into the forest and reduce the fuel loads and the potential for catastrophic wildfires. Sadly, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and this administration have all failed to adequately fund that program. And until, as you pointed out 2 years ago, the Forest Service was required to pay for all its own fires until I and others got that law changed. So every year they would stop the fuel reduction programs to pay for fighting the fires because they were overspending their budget. That's not going to happen anymore, but we still need a hell of a lot more investment in those programs. But, and I would also point out that I'm pretty familiar with all this. The Forest Service came about right back at the beginning of the last century. We had the Great Fires of 2010. There was a huge debate between the new chief of the Forest Service and the Secretary of the Interior. The Secretary of the Interior said, we should go back to low-intensity fire, which the Native Americans used for centuries when these forests used to look like parks. Otherwise, we're going to end up with huge fuel loads. Unfortunately, the chief of the Forest Service won, and he said, no, we're going to fight these like it's a war, and we're going to put out every fire that ever happens if we can. And that began massive fuel buildups that continue to this day, that sort of mismanagement. We need to get those lands back to the way they were. And in my district, 273,000 acres burned in just up the river from me.
Well,
no, if I can. 273,000 acres. 2/3 of those acres were heavily managed, thinned, clear-cut, or other managed industrial forest lands. They torched, and then the old growth along the Mackenzie River torched. We've never had fires like this before. The Mackenzie River is wet and damp, and those were old growth trees. You know, no one was ever saying, gee, let's go cut down all the old growth trees lining the Mackenzie River. That wasn't the problem. It wasn't fuel buildup. It was that a utility didn't de-energize. The lines went down. This is not proven yet. 7 miles above Blue River, the wind blew like a blowtorch. It blew the wind through that city, that town. It's gone. It looks like Dresden. It's gone. Every house, everything is gone. Luckily, the high school was outside of town. Survivors gathered there. The firefighters valiantly kept them alive overnight till they could be rescued the next day. And the sheriff and the firefighters led caravans down the single road, single highway, getting out of that town. Hundreds and hundreds of people, trees falling across the road, burning. Big, old growth trees falling across the road, burning. And they jumped out of their rigs, they cut them with chainsaws, and they pushed them out of the side, and they evacuated almost everybody. It could have been like Paradise, California. Yes, we need to manage better on our lands, but this stuff is far beyond the intensity of anything ever seen before. We don't get northeast winds at hurricane force. Never happened before. We don't have 6% humidity in Oregon. Never happened before. We used to get snowpack every winter that wet the fuels. Doesn't happen anymore. This is a little more complicated than saying, oh, there's some environmental laws stopping this. Let's invest in the HIFRA program. I supported it. The Enviros objected at the time. It's worked pretty darn well, except that we've put a pittance of money into it. We need to put billions of dollars into the HIFRA program, fuel reduction, and stop this stuff. With that, I would yield now to the next person on the list, who is Representative Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to see that we are advancing H.R. 8226, as I mentioned earlier, the FEMA Assistance Relief Act of 2020, which I joined as an original co-sponsor. As California continues to fight wildfires and local governments have been cash-strapped due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, this is a critical bipartisan bill that will help local governments continue to respond to those emergencies and build on the actions we have taken to end the practice of fire borrowing in the U.S. Forest Service. This bill we are considering today makes significant changes to ensure safety and provide much needed resources for our communities. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now we have Representative Finkenauer. Abby?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Graves. I am happy to speak in support of the FEMA Assistance Relief Act and grateful this has come before the committee and grateful for the chairman's work on this bill. Obviously, we've heard today in committee horrifying stories of natural disasters that have now occurred all over our country. And in my district in particular,
Oh, Abby froze.
in my district in particular, we were hit with what was essentially like a Category 4 hurricane. It was 140-mile-per-hour winds that came through the state and devastated one of the second largest city in the state, Cedar Rapids, and also surrounding communities. I know, Chairman, you've been to my district, and the destruction that we've seen has been devastating on so many levels, whether it's trees that landed on houses, on cars, the cleanup that has had to happen with the cities, with the counties, but also those first 5 days after the storm, having folks not have a place to stay. We didn't even have a shelter until the Friday after the storm, when the storm came on Monday. folks needed food. It was, again, one of those things that I will never forget and never want to see happen in our country again. Why this bill and this is so important right now, and why I'm excited that you took the lead on this, Chairman, is because, as we've also heard from our colleagues across all over the country, both Democrat and Republican, our cities and our counties are hurting right now through this pandemic. And now, with facing natural disasters that have occurred again all over the country, they need help and they need more assistance that they're getting. And why this is so important is when we can reduce this cost share, it helps making sure that our first responders are getting what they need, the ones who've been the heroes, who've been on the front line. And it is more important than ever that this gets done and that we change the cost share and make sure that folks in these counties and these cities are able to bring in the assistance that they need for our constituents across the country. This is something I believe the president could do himself. Unfortunately, we don't see that happening at the moment, and it is why this is so important on a bipartisan level through Congress right now to get this done and get this passed. And I, again, am grateful for your leadership, and I know we just have so much work left to do, but this is a step in the right direction to make sure that our constituents and our cities and our counties get what they need and can recover from these horrifying natural disasters that we are seeing all across the country every single day, basically, right now. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I pass back.
I thank the gentlelady for her statement, and again, regret the extraordinary damage that was done to her largest city and to many other residents of the state in seemingly unprecedented severe weather event. With that, I'd recognize Representative Huffman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And on a day when we've really shown some good bipartisan problem solving, I'm saddened to see some real rotten partisanship, unfortunately, creep into this conversation. The truth is, before these terrible fire years in the West, there was a pre-existing agenda to do a whole bunch of massive backcountry logging with new roads and to get the environmental protections that are on the books. And unfortunately, we're seeing some folks use recent tragedies as an excuse to dust off that pre-existing agenda and pretend that we can go into the backcountry and log our way to fire resilience. You can't. And Mr. Chairman, you did a great job of explaining that when you add up these conditions in cases like California, fueled by a massive multi-year drought and hot temperatures and extreme winds and weather that are all about climate change, when you do those things, these fires rip through all types of land that has been managed in all types of ways: private land, state land, U.S. Forest Service land, completely cut over land, chaparral land that you could never log even if you tried to. So let's just stop the pretextual game of pretending that we're going to somehow gut the environmental laws and log our way to fire safety. That's not the answer to this situation. I also want to take great exception and express my disappointment to the notion from my colleague from Louisiana that somehow the local governments in my district do not have skin in the game. Let me tell you, my district and every county and city that I represent is struggling right now because this pandemic has ripped through our communities and the economies of our communities, and that's because there's been a complete failure of national leadership. Had there been even a modicum of competency and honesty and vision from this administration, this pandemic would not have come to many of these communities. So let's not pretend that we're not all suffering through this because of a failure of leadership at the national level. This is not about skin in the game for struggling local governments who've seen their revenues crash, who would much rather be taking care of the mechanics of providing sanitation and public safety and other services to their community instead of dealing with a pandemic that President Trump made much, much worse through his incompetence, dishonesty, and corruption. Finally, with respect to these wildfires, Mr. Chairman, I think it's just deeply disappointing that when we have been there for other communities around the country that have been ravaged by natural disaster, there's a suggestion that somehow now is the time to start caring about deficits and process and invoking this skin in the game nonsense. Our communities are reeling. We've been there for other communities in similar circumstances. And this is one of those moments where we need to remember that we're all Americans. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Having no further requests of time, we will now move to consideration of amendments. Take this off. Amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute for our HR 8266. Before doing so, the chair would like to note that while the amendment in the nature of a substitute for HR 8266 is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, for the convenience of members and staff on both sides of the aisle, we will be considering amendments in the order they were filed, alternating between the majority and the minority. With that in mind, the committee will now proceed to the consideration of amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute. Representative Mucarsel-Powell is the first to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to HR 8266, offered by Ms. Mucarsel-Powell, number 037.
Without objection, the amendment be considered as read. I recognize Rep. Mucarsel-Powell to speak on her amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. This amendment addresses the fact that all but 6 states have applied for Hazard Mitigation Grant Program assistance as part of this major disaster declaration request for COVID-19. Yet not a single state has been granted such hazard mitigation assistance. My own state of Florida, which has had some of the highest rates of COVID-19 and it is in the middle of a hurricane season, has requested this much needed assistance. But FEMA has completely turned a blind eye. This is just simply unacceptable. My amendment would automatically approve hazard mitigation grant program assistance for all states and tribes that have applied for it as part of their major disaster declaration request for COVID-19. We already know that the value of hazard mitigation assistance, it helps reduce future damages and leads to a positive return on our investment of between $3 and $11 for every dollar spent. But during this pandemic, when our states and cities are desperate for any financial help they can get, this assistance is even more important now. And just imagine, Mr. Chair, this amendment would mean an additional $250 million roughly for my home state of Florida alone, which could be used right now to take flood risk reduction measures like improving drainage or stormwater management facilities, relocating or elevating structures, or burying power lines. With hurricanes hitting our shores, fires burning up large portions of our country, like you stated, and Americans appending their lives in an effort to escape the virus, we cannot ignore or wait any longer to respond to requests for assistance. I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Others wish to be heard on the amendment. Sam? Ranking Member Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. FEMA's hazard mitigation program has a limited pot of funds, and they are specifically designed to address the resiliency of physical structures and the infrastructure. This amendment could compete with projects that have already been proven to reduce the impacts of flooding and hurricanes and wildfires and earthquakes and save lives. And I can't support this amendment. I would oppose it, and with that, I'll just yield back to balance.
Others wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman, if I may respond.
Excuse me, what?
If I may respond, Mr. Chair, just a quick response to that.
Without objection, gentlelady is recognized for a quick response.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Graves.
Who took my statement?
Congress, if you remember, Congress appropriated $45 billion in CARES Act for the DRF, and the president has only allowed $44 billion of that to be used because they're using part of those funds for the unemployment assistance program. So I urge you to support this amendment. Right now, what we're seeing is that Senate Republicans and the administration need to come to the table and negotiate in good faith to properly provide additional unemployment benefits, but at the same time, supporting the DRF instead of pulling funds from the DRF. We know that we would have plenty of money available for disaster recovery if that was the case. And again, I urge support for this amendment. In my district, in Monroe County, we are seeing flooding, increased flooding due to king tides, due to the effects of climate change. This is funds that, like I stated earlier, would really help alleviate any flood mitigation efforts. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, gentlelady. Others wishing to be heard, Representative Graves from Louisiana.
Mr. Chairman, I want to make note that in my earlier comments, I did not say a single thing about political parties, about specific members of Congress. I didn't say one partisan thing, but I sat here and I listened to all these partisan attacks. I have a policy disagreement, and I'll say it again. I think I have more experience with disasters than everybody else in this committee put together. This is what I did. And to sit here and listen to people drag this into partisan fighting. You know, Mr. Huffman, let's talk about this for a little bit. You want to talk about partisan? Let's talk partisan for just a minute. You know what? You want to talk about the balanced budget? There was a balanced budget amendment you voted against. You want to talk about the cost share and what it should be for disasters? You know what? My home state, we've lost 2,000 square miles of our coast because of the federal government's actions. You voted against every single time we've tried to get additional funds dedicated 100% to the restoration of our coast. You voted against climate adaptation funds for your own state of California. Now, you want to tell me I'm wrong? I'll absolutely. I'll show you the voting record. I'll show you the video of you on the record doing it. So you want to talk about partisan fights? Yeah, we can do this all day long. I chose to not go there. You chose. No, I'm not going to yield. You chose to go there. I didn't say a single policy thing. I didn't say a single thing attacking anyone in this committee. But you want to come in and start. Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman from Louisiana controls the time. If he yields to you, you may speak. Otherwise, he may complete his statement.
Mr. Chairman, 2 years ago in the Disaster Reform Recovery Act, we actually put an incentive in place to where we incentivize state and local governments to be proactive and to carry out preventative measures. We reduced their cost share. We did that because we wanted them to lean forward. And that was great policy. It was bipartisan policy. And so this is moving in the other direction. And I hear people sitting here saying, well, my local government, you know what, mine is too. Mine is too, but I'll say it again. You have three options. You raise taxes, you cut spending, or you incur debt on the backs of our children and grandchildren. And every dollar we spend today, we're asking them to pay $4, $5, $6 on it. If there's ever a time to incur debt, yes, it's now. But it doesn't mean we need to be irresponsible on those dollars. It means we need to be principled. We need to be disciplined on those dollars and making sure that we're investing them. This underlying amendment, Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate the gentlewoman's intention here. But in addition, what we did under the umbrella of DARA, I believe we pulled it out and did it in the approps bill, but we also did this BRIC program where we took 7% and leaned it forward on proactive mitigation measures. Under this, we're moving it to 100% federal. We're funding things like government operations. We have no bounds or sideboards or criteria on what that is. And then we're going to give them 15% back in terms of hazard mitigation on top of that when you're effectively incentivizing them to spend more money. I don't think this is in the best interest of taxpayers. Do I share every single one of your goals in regard to helping to protect and fight for the people that we represent? Absolutely. But that fighting includes making sure that we don't make our government, our future, our children and grandchildren's future unsustainable from irresponsible debt. Again, it's not a partisan attack. I just disagree. Now, you want to talk partisan? Take a look at the unemployment numbers. The top 10 states with unemployment, 8 of them are Democrat governors, 8 of them. And it's black and white data. Fight with me. It's black and white data. You want to talk about protection of citizens? This is a state and local government control issue. They're the ones who are putting the different restrictions in place in terms of what can happen and not happen. In my own home state, I think we've got some that are going too far in each direction. So don't sit here and try and hang this on everybody. Look, I have a policy disagreement with this bill. It's not a partisan fight. So I really, this committee, the one reason I want to be here is because we generally don't have these stupid fights. And I really hate the fact that people have chosen to drag this in that direction. You want to have that fight? I'll do it all day long. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, in regard to New Orleans. As you know, I've spent a little bit of time working on this. New Orleans, the Venice Project, the West Shore Project, the Lake Pontchartrain Vicinity Project, these projects date back to the early 1970s. The federal government didn't implement them properly. They didn't implement it at all. And in some cases, that includes the area south of New Orleans. So I was very well aware when I made my statement that there was the likelihood that someone was going to bring that issue up. I did it intentionally, and I think that it's apples and oranges. I yield back.
I thank gentleman for observing his time. I would observe that the 100% cost share went also to the states of Louisiana, Alabama, and I believe Texas, where we did not have failed federal levies. So with that, others wish to be heard on the amendment by Ms. Powell. Okay, I'll recognize myself. I would note that because the House has passed an extension of federal unemployment assistance, which most states, my state took it up, except they haven't been able to disperse it. Their unemployment department's a mess. Other states are struggling because it's a new program. It was funded by $44 billion withdrawn from the hazard mitigation program. That's how it was funded, because of Senate inaction on that issue, even though it passed the House. Now, you can label that partisan, but it's just a fact. $44 billion. This, I believe, has substantially more merit, and that program should have been funded in regular order. I'm going to be voting again today on extending unemployment assistance in the House, either today or tonight or tomorrow at the latest. So we shouldn't be taking money out of the hazard mitigation program to pay for that. It should come from the general fund of the United States government. When HMGP was first added to the Stafford Act, the intent was to capture a fraction of overall disaster relief, whether emergency, temporary, or permanent, provided as a block grant to the requesting state to fund mitigation projects, to prevent future damage, to prevent future costs to the bankrupt federal flood insurance program, for example. Disaster relief under Stafford Section 403, the type of assistance that FEMA is using to support the fight against the pandemic, is normally counted toward a state's HMGP calculation. The half year of silence from the president and FEMA on the still pending gubernatorial requests for HMGP tied to COVID is troubling. And further, as the Congresswoman has noted, there is demonstrable return on investment for various mitigation projects, as documented by the National Institute of Building Sciences. I see no good reason to restrict states, tribes, territories from using this to reduce the costs and the impacts of future disasters. I think it's a good investment, and I support the amendment. Others wish to be heard. Hearing none, then are there amendments to the amendment? Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask, if I can get my mask off, unanimous consent that amendments number Graves 234, 235.
Well, the gentleman, what we're talking about is an amendment to her amendment, then we'll move on to yours.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Never mind.
All right, okay. Are there amendments to, not the amendment in nature of substitute, but are there amendments to this particular amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Okay, hearing none, then the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those
Aye.
Aye.
I forget about the delay, okay. Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, the amendment is agreed to. Now, are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Graves Amendments number 234, 235, 244, and 245 be considered in block.
Without objection?
Thank you.
Wait. Oh, the clerk has to, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Clarification, were there just 4 amendments being considered?
Oh, I'm sorry, and 250. So 234, 235, 244, 245, and 250.
Amendment to the amendment, an en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 234, 235, 245, 244, 241.
I think he said 250 also, didn't he, Garrett?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify, 234, 235, 244, 245, and 250.
Why can't he just write it down?
Total of 5 amendments?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. An en bloc amendment to the amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 8266 offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, consisting of the following. Amendments numbered 234, 235, 244, 245, and 250.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I recognize Representative Graves to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as I stated in my opening statement, under existing federal regulation, 44 CFR 206.47, it lays out a process by which you can have a lower non-federal cost share. It's already in federal regulation. And as I also noted earlier, Section 1232 of DARA that we just did 2 years ago, it requires that FEMA take into consideration multiple disasters in an area, and you're able to aggregate those and look at it cumulatively to determine if you've crossed the threshold into a lower non-federal cost share. So what this amendment does is it strikes, one of the amendments, number 234, it strikes the shall be at 100%, and it says it may be at 100%, therefore tying it back to the existing regulations that are in place. Amendment number 235 points back to Section 1232 of existing law where we amended the Stafford Act to look at the cumulative impacts to ensure, Mr. Chairman, that that's taken into consideration. Amendment number 244. It actually improves upon, because I made note earlier, Mr. Chairman, that I don't believe that FEMA has really abided by the intentions of the committee when they've promulgated the policy or the regulations under 1232. I don't think it really achieved the objectives of what we intended, and so this tries to kind of improve that to make sure that they're truly looking at the cumulative impact of those disasters. And amendment number 1245 ensures, as I mentioned, that the bill has provisions that causes 100% federal cost for government services, for online government operations and things like that. So what this amendment does is it simply puts in criteria, and it says reasonable cost. Therefore, since there's no non-federal cost share under the legislation, the base text, this just tries to put some type of sideboards on the cost, reasonable cost, and also explicitly states that it's directly tied back to the coronavirus or the pandemic. So I believe that these are a step in the right direction. I think they're good policy. I think they're consistent with what this committee has done in the past, and I'd urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman's work on these amendments. Given the volume of catastrophic disasters in recent years, the committee will most certainly be working on consideration of a significant set of Stafford amendments to build upon the work of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. And I know that Chairwoman Titus, Ranking Member Katko, and formerly Ranking Member Meadows have laid the groundwork for that later in this Congress or in the next. And I'm happy to work with you as well as any other committees that have jurisdiction over any conflicting or duplicative federal disaster assistance, so we can cut out as much red tape as possible. That doesn't help people, and help our disaster-ravaged districts recover as quickly, as fully as possible. With that, are there others who wish to be heard on these amendments en bloc? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I left off one amendment, number 250. I also just want to make reference to that. This was actually the text of a Congressman Nadler bill that Congressman Rouser is a co-sponsor of, Congressman Davis is a co-sponsor of, Congressman Garamendi is a co-sponsor of, and other members of this committee. Congresswoman Holmes Norton is a co-sponsor of. What it does is it amends the Stafford Act to ensure that common areas of condominium complexes are also eligible for assistance as though that would be a private condominium or a private home. What happened is that under existing regulation and law, FEMA looks at common areas as excluded whenever the reality is that it's a partial ownership by a private individual, and so it does make those eligible. I'll be honest, I have some concerns about some text of the bill, but I was asked to offer this by amendment. I certainly support the spirit of it, and also just wanted to make clear that that's part of the en bloc. Yield back.
Are there other members who wish to be heard? Okay, hearing none, we would move to consideration of the amendments en bloc. Okay. Are there, if not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of, Yeah, I know that. Okay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? And who am I recognizing now? That was it? Okay. Representative Graves. Recognized. Clerk will designate the amendment. Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask unanimous consent in this case to have Graves Amendment number 239, 240, and 247 considered en bloc? 239, 240, and 247 considered en bloc, 3 amendments.
The clerk will designate.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 8266, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 239, 240, 246, and 247.
With what?
No.
You should write them down as he says them, and that way you wouldn't have to look for the pieces of paper.
Mr. Chairman, just going to clarify, it's number 239, 240, and 247. 239, 240, and 247.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 8266, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 239, 240, and 247.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read. I recognize Mr. Graves speak on his amendments for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just going to be very brief here. These are 3 amendments. Number 1, what it does is it simply has the Inspector General review or audit advance payments that are made under the legislation. Number 2, it ensures that law enforcement are eligible for PPE equipment as well under the legislation. And the 3rd amendment, which is number 247, is a report on the pandemic. And what this one does is it basically looks at it has the national academies come together. I think we all agree, Mr. Chairman, that Stafford is not really, at least I think most of us don't often think about pandemics when we think of disasters, yet this is the framework that is being used. I think we often look at physical disasters and things along those lines like hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and others. And so this has the national academies look at Stafford Act and ultimately make recommendations to us to how we could perhaps make changes to Stafford to better reflect the pandemic and lessons learned from this pandemic. I urge adoption of the unblock amendment and yield back.
I thank gentlemen for unblocking these amendments. On 239, I have no doubt that the DHS Inspector General would already be interested in auditing any advance assistance provided by FEMA under this act, but I'm happy to be certain of that by including this amendment. On 240, when our staff worked on drafting this clarification assistance section back in the spring, we believed, and we still do, that first responders, as I think is generally understood, is inclusive of law enforcement, firefighters, and emergency medical services. But to be absolutely, totally 100% certain in the interest of ensuring that law enforcement entities are eligible for reimbursement for any COVID-related PPE and disinfection services, I support that amendment. And on 247, I appreciate the nonpartisan external perspective of the National Academy of Sciences in making recommendation on future cost share adjustment factors, as well as recommendations to FEMA to enhance future preparedness for any similar future pandemic events. I thank the gentleman, and I urge adoption of the amendment. Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none, we will move to consideration of the amendment. Are there further amendments to the amendment? Did I hear somebody? No? Okay. I hear none. If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment's agreed to. Okay, are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Graves from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment number 241.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute H.R. 8266, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 241.
The clerk will, as designated, without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I recognize Mr. Graves to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is the text of H.R. 1311, which is a bipartisan bill that has passed out of this committee by voice vote. This is a legislation that I worked on very closely with Congresswoman Plaskett, with Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon, with Congressman Rouser, and other members, I believe Congressman Cohen and others in the initial draft of the legislation. Mr. Chairman, we've had witnesses come before this committee and talk about under Department of Commerce, the EDA disaster program, under HUD, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, and other disaster programs, and it's crystal clear that they're models that work better than others. For example, I'm doing this from memory, which there's an excellent chance that I'm off on my timeline here, but as I recall, I think that HUD hit the 60% disbursement mark on average 7 years after we appropriated the funds to them. These are disasters. I mean, look, all of us virtually have been through it. HUD is not a disaster agency. Their awful implementation of these programs transcending Republican and Democrat administrations. The record is clear that they can't do this. They just can't. They can't get the money out the door. You have urgent needs of our constituents. It doesn't make sense. We after much lessons learned from states that have actually been through disasters over and over again, we have set up a framework to address unmet needs within FEMA. It is a much more efficient program that responds to lessons learned over disasters we've had in the past few decades in the United States. Mr. Chairman, I'll say it again, Congressman Plaskett, Congressman Rouser, we've worked with Congressman Cohen, we've worked with Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon and others. It's simply, and it's passed out of this committee by voice vote. It's a bipartisan bill. I would urge adoption of the amendment. This is Graves number 241, and again, it's the text of H.R. 1311 that everyone has supported in the past. Yield back.
I thank the Congressman for yet another amendment. Do other members wish to be heard? Before addressing the substance of this one, I want to take a moment to note how sorry I am now to be a bona fide member of the ever-growing group of members who represent districts that have experienced widespread and catastrophic destruction from increasingly treacherous natural disasters. I've talked about it earlier, and I have no illusion, having had one town in my district wiped out, 2 in Kurt Schrader's district, 2 in Greg Walden's district, which were not in a forested area. I have no illusion that our recovery will be simple or fast, and I am committed to working on meaningful reforms of Stafford Act to assure more efficient, equitable recovery of survivors and communities. As for this amendment, though while I supported our committee's earlier action on the gentleman's bill, H.R. 1311, I cannot support inserting it into this measure. Doing so will kill this bill. They go on and on, but apparently it triggers a CBO score or something. The wonderful Office of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, as Al Swift once famously said to Fazio, the trolls with the green eye shades who hide under the bridge and come out and gnaw on your ankles when you want to do something productive. So given the objections of OMB, it would kill the bill, and I will oppose the amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Read all this crap.
if we bowed to OMB, we'd never get anything done.
Well, in this case, I want to get this bill done, so I am opposed to the amendment. Do others wish to be heard on the amendment? Hearing none, then we will move other amendments to the amendment. Hearing none, then the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. Aye. Oh, sorry. Nay. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to this bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have...
Representative Graves is recognized. The clerk will designate this amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Amendment number 246.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 8266, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 246.
Okay. The amendment is designated without objection. The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, look, my spider senses indicate that maybe you're losing patience over there, but I want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, every single one of these amendments are amendments that are the result of different lessons learned from disaster policy. I want to thank you, Chairman.
Sitting next to you here has been an enjoyable time. I have told other people that you are probably the only one I know who is more sarcastic than I am. And I want you to know that it was a pleasure. It was much more pleasurable when you were the ranking member and I was the chairman, but it has been a pleasure nonetheless. Our staff...
Somebody's listening to resources and it's somehow, or that's, yeah.
Would whoever that is...
That's Rob Bishop.
Huh?
That's Rob Bishop. It's Utah. That's and there's a markup in resources, so I don't know how he's.
Well, then he's violating the rules of the House. Because mute the member who's out of order and also violating the rules of the House by participating in 2 virtual events at the same time.
He's not on this committee. It's something's going on with the system, sir.
I think now we're allowed to use Zoom now that we have decided that the threat of the Chinese listening to long, insufferable, boring hearings and markups is over. Then I would suggest that we convert this committee to Zoom. I'm suggesting that to the tech person because WebEx stinks. With that, I would recognize the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to say again, I don't have any desire to delay this committee's actions on the legislation. All of these amendments are the direct result of different disasters and lessons learned from disasters that we've had. This amendment, what it does is it actually addresses something that we've already fixed. Once again, in DARA in 2018, bipartisan legislation passing out of this committee unanimously. What we did is we said that if you are a disaster victim and you went and took a disaster loan from the Small Business Administration, because those were the only funds that were available in the aftermath of a disaster. If you're looking around, your home's destroyed, you don't have a place to keep your family, you don't have the ability to buy food or drive a car, yes, you're going to go take the only resources that are available. Well, then whenever Congress comes in, weeks, months, or even years later and appropriates funds through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program through HUD, policy said, and again, transcending Republican and Democrat administrations, awful, further victimizing policy said that if you took a loan, you're ineligible for a grant. So if Mr. Rouser and I both flood or go through some type of disaster, and I'm kicking back in a FEMA paid-for hotel room, and Mr. Rouser's trying to figure out how to lean forward and protect his family and get them back in a safe house as quickly as possible, he goes and takes the loan. I'm sitting in a FEMA paid-for hotel room, and then months later when Congress acts, I can then get a 100% grant. Mr. Rouser's stuck paying back his $150,000 loan. He's ineligible for the grant. It doesn't make sense. You should be penalizing me for sitting in a hotel room that taxpayers are paying for. You should be rewarding him. But under existing system, it's the opposite. Thankfully, and I want to thank members of this committee, we fixed it in 2018. But I want to say, this HUD, under this administration, completely botched the interpretation. They haven't complied with a single thing that's in the provision. And so there were timelines in there, they missed them. There were actions they were supposed to be taking, they missed them. The state of North Carolina, the state of Louisiana, Puerto Rico, and I think there was Texas. Governors all asked to have this authority exercised in their state under the law. The governor would have to submit a letter. And we have people in my state. We appropriated $1.7 billion in these funds 3.5 years ago. To this day, only $700 million has been given to homeowners, and you got people that are still out of their homes and stuck with over $1 billion sitting in the bank. This doesn't make any sense. And so this amendment fixes it. It fixes it for North Carolina. It fixes it for Puerto Rico. It fixes it for Virgin Islands, for Florida, for Texas. It simply ensures the intent of Congress is complied with, ensuring that you're not further victimizing somebody like under this scenario that I made up with Mr. Rouser and I, where you're causing further, you're incentivizing people to sit in a FEMA hotel room. It doesn't make sense. You want to get your community recovered, restored as quickly as possible. Mr. Chairman, I know that you got a little heartburn here, but this is good policy. It's simply defending the authority of this branch of government that HUD has completely screwed up. And I'd strongly urge adoption of this amendment. We've got to fix this issue. HUD even refused to come sit in front of this committee because they know they're wrong. They know they are. And they've refused to come sit in front of this committee and be held accountable under oversight. So I'd urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. I want to thank the congressman for yet another amendment and stress how vital our states and communities this increased federal cost share will be. for disasters which they're currently dealing with recovering. I appreciate that there have been and may be issues faced by survivors who are deemed to have duplication of benefits, especially in the case of conflicts between insurance payouts, FEMA grants, SBA loans. This bill is not the vehicle to address that. We have moved Ranking Member Graves' H.R. 5953, the Preventing the Disaster Revictimization Act, which deals with preventing unnecessary clawbacks of survivor assistance. And I'm happy to work with you and any other committees that have jurisdiction over any assistance that could lead to a duplication, but this bill is simply not the appropriate vehicle. Given the volume of catastrophic disasters in recent years, as I said earlier, the committee will be working on consideration of significant Stafford Act reforms to build upon the work of the DRRA. I'm not recognizing anybody. I'm not quite done yet. And I know Chairwoman Titus, Ranking Member Katko, and I said previously Ranking Member Meadows before, have laid groundwork for that. So I'll reiterate one, hopefully last time, the underlying bill addresses cost share adjustments for only a 1-year-long window. It does not modify the underlying Stafford Act. That is not the issue before us today. Our states and communities cannot wait for the relief this bill would provide. Accepting this amendment would ensure progress would be suspended by a much more complicated fight as we try to untangle a thicket of disaster relief programs, multiple committee jurisdictions with this amendment. Again, you have my commitment to work with you on the challenge of duplication of benefits. We accepted and worked together on a bipartisan basis with Ranking Member Graves on this, the other Graves, Sam Graves, earlier this year. And if further work is needed, as you know, in amending the Stafford Act, I'd be happy to address that in the future. Others wish to be heard on this amendment? Hearing none. Are there amendments to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, this is Congresswoman Plaskett.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. And I'm grateful for your willingness to work with those of us who are concerned about this issue. I just wanted to voice my support for this amendment. After Hurricanes Irma and Maria, in the Virgin Islands, some people who had insurance did not have enough to cover all costs. Some of them took out SBA loans to begin recovery and work on their homes right away. Some of those who took out SBA loans to help cover the gap are now still saddled with these loans, and many of these individuals have completely destroyed homes. Under the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, governors have the ability to request a waiver of Stafford Act prohibitions regarding duplication of federal benefits if it is in the public interest and will not result in waste, fraud, and abuse. And carrying out this authority, the Act clarifies that a loan cannot be determined to be a duplication of assistance. However, with this new provision in federal law, those who took out SBA loan right after a major disaster, some out of desperation, others out of a need to begin rebuilding right away so that they could live in their homes, begin the healing process, they should be able to use any community development block grant funds that they received to repay that SBA loan. I believe that was the intent of DRRA. But I understand your concerns, and I'm grateful for your willingness to continue to work with those of us on this issue. Thanks so much.
Thank the gentlelady. Do others wish to be heard? The gentleman's recognized.
Oh, okay. There we go. Hit the wrong button. No, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to comment on this particular amendment. I think the only thing that my friend from Louisiana has gotten wrong this morning is he didn't start with this amendment. This amendment is, I think, much needed, and I understand what the chairman was saying. I totally understand what he's saying. I just happen to disagree that now's not the appropriate time. You know, time can't. A lot of folks out there, they can't wait. We had Hurricane Matthew
in 2016, Hurricane Florence in 2018, 2 hurricanes that devastated my district. This is a fundamental problem that we have throughout the country, and I really think we need to work on this and work on this fast. I also would add the fundamental problem I think the federal government has across the board is all of the incentives are wrong, are backwards. And that's what this amendment, would be fundamentally fixing, is getting those incentives right, as my friend from Louisiana said very eloquently earlier. So with that, Mr. Chairman, those are my thoughts. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. I think, as I said earlier, the amendment has merit as an amendment to the Stafford Act. The staff informs me that the Appropriations Committee has asked for clarification of what the impact this would have from the Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management and Budget has refused to clarify. Appropriations will require the leadership to kill the bill if this amendment is adopted. So if you want to kill the bill, adopt this amendment. And there's nothing I can do about that. I can't make OMB render an adjustment, and I cannot get my leadership to waive the extreme concerns of the Appropriations Committee. They just won't do it. So that's a fact. So are there further other amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment as offered. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Adopted. Are there further amendments at the desk?
Mr. Chairman, can I ask you a question? Just asking, would you entertain if we added a UC provision to it that made it clear that no new appropriations could result? I'm talking about...
I don't know the implications of that, Garrett. We can't do this stuff on the fly. And I consider this bill extremely important.
Okay.
We've already adopted Sam's bill on this. If further work is necessary for duplication, we will take it up later.
All right. Sam's bill doesn't address this, though. I just want to be clear. Mr. Chairman, I have amendment number 248 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8266, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 248.
The amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I first want to go back and I just want to reiterate this. I'm not asking for, on the previous amendment, I'm not asking for a penny of additional funds. These are all existing appropriations that HUD can't get out the door because they can't figure out how to find their way out of a wet paper bag. It's ridiculous what's happening. Mr. Chairman, in regard to amendment number 248, once again, in DARA in 2018, this committee had expert testimony, and many of us talked to emergency coordinators across the United States about the problems with a temporary housing program where FEMA would come in and provide temporary housing through the STEP program, which I think was an innovative idea that was deployed up in Hurricane Sandy. It was I think, really created in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. It was been used in Texas, been used in Louisiana, and other cases. So you have temporary, and then you have permanent housing. And what ends up happening is that FEMA was spending money, ridiculous amounts of money, to the tune of nearly $200,000 per trailer that you could buy down the street at the trailer dealer for $28,000. And then they would go into homes and they would end up doing these cheap renovations to a home only to have the permanent fix come in through another federal program that would rip it all out the next week. It didn't make sense. So thankfully, in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, we did a provision in there that was section 1211. And what it did is it simply allowed for state and local governments to administer temporary and permanent housing. But what it did is it said that FEMA had 2 years to finalize the regulations. Then in the 2-year interim period, they could operate a pilot program. Look, I'm not patting anybody on the back here. FEMA missed the 2-year deadline to get to finish their final regulations, which means that disaster victims are going to be the ones that suffer, and taxpayers are going to be the ones that suffer because we're going to end up spending way too much money in the aftermath of these disasters. We'll do a temporary fix that's ripped out the next week, only to come in and do a permanent fix on top of it. This allows the state and local governments and tribes to actually do a more innovative program that's more cost effective and really looks at the needs of disaster victims while saving taxpayer money. So what this does is it does give FEMA an additional year, and I want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, it drives me crazy like you when agencies don't meet deadlines that are established by law, but what happens by missing the deadline is that you further victimize disaster victims. So this simply strikes the 2 years that's in DARA. It extends it to 3 years, which would be until October of next year, gives them one additional year, and I guess I do have to be fair. This has been an extraordinary 2 or 3 years in regard to disasters in the United States with COVID and other things, but I still want to say that I think it's inappropriate that agencies miss statutory deadlines. This just ensures that disaster victims and taxpayers aren't the ones that suffer as a result. It extends it for 1 more year. Graves number 248, I'd urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Recognize myself at such time as may consume. The gentleman began his remarks by referencing the previous amendment and how HUD can't manage its way out of a wet paper bag in terms of dispersing critically needed assistance. And I'd urge the gentleman perhaps to join with me and other members of the committee in expressing our displeasure to Secretary Ben Carson, who runs Housing and Urban Development, and tell him to get his act together and the agency's act together. As so far as this amendment goes, I'm prepared to accept the amendment. Do others wish to be heard? Are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none, the vote is on the amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. In the opinion of the chair, well, that's not the opinion of the chair. The amendment is adopted. So are there additional amendments? Okay. The question is on the amendment and the nature of substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Hello?
Aye.
Okay. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment nature substitute is agreed to. The question is now on adoption favorably reporting H.R. 8266 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House.
Finally.
We now move on to H.R. 4358, Preliminary Damage Assessment Improvement Act of 2019. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4538, and I call up the bill for consideration. Without the clerk, doesn't the clerk have to designate? Doesn't say it. The clerk will designate? No. What? Just keep it. Okay, keep going.
H.R. 40.
Yep.
H.R. 4358.
Okay. Without objection, first reading bill is dispensed with. The amendment of nature substitute offered by Rep. Katko, ranking member, Subcommittee on Economic, Public Buildings, Emergency Management as filed. Does ranking member Katko wish to offer his amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer that amendment on behalf of ranking member Katko.
Yes, I apparently had to leave. He just spoke to me a moment ago, so I regret that things went on to the point where he didn't get to speak. The amendment in nature substitute has been distributed electronically to members, and I recognize, now the clerk will designate.
You don't have anything to say on it?
The clerk will designate.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 4358 offered by Mr. Katko, number 075.
Okay, considered as read, shall be considered base text, and the gentleman, Mr. Palmer, is recognized, given that Mr. Katko had a conflict. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for allowing me to speak on behalf of Representative Katko. So I'm pleased to, on his behalf, to sponsor H.R. 4358, the Preliminary Damage Assessment Improvement Act, along with Mr. Cunningham of South Carolina. The Preliminary Damage Assessment, or PDAs, play a critical role in assessing and validating the impact of disaster. PDAs establish foundation for further assistance requests and are essential to the overall disaster relief process. Although FEMA is currently required to designate officials to support states and local communities in the PDA process, inconsistencies and turnovers in staffing can endanger access to critical relief. H.R. 4358 requires FEMA to report on FEMA's role in the PDA process, including staffing and training. The bill also directs FEMA to take measures to ensure FEMA teams involved in damage assessments are appropriately trained and consistent. Whether FEMA is responding to flooding in Mr. Catco's district on Lake Ontario's southern shore, or hurricanes in South Carolina's low country, or natural disasters in any other impacted community nationwide, and particularly in Alabama recently, consistency and dependability are key. I want to thank the American Flood Coalition for working with Mr. Catco and Representative Cunningham on this important legislation. I would also like to thank Chair Titus and other key stakeholders for working with Mr. Catco and Mr. Cunningham to make necessary improvements to H.R. 4358. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman for representing Mr. Catco's views. I congratulate again Ranking Member Catco for his work on this important legislation, along with who's the gentleman from South Carolina? With Mr. Cunningham. Do others wish to be heard? I support the amendment. Do others the amendment? Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none, we will now move to the bill. We'll now consider the bill for amendment. Are there amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If not, the question is on the amendment, nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment of nature substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption favorable reporting of H.R. 4358 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 8326, Child Care is Economic Development Act of 2020. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4538. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Okay, the clerk doesn't have to say anything. Okay. I thank the representative from Iowa. Hopefully she was able to stay on. This has gone on for a while. Representative Finkenauer for bringing this important legislation forward and working with my staff to get it ready for markup. Access to child care is an essential part of regional economic development and is largely ignored in federal economic development planning. This legislation changes that by making sure local economic development districts consider the availability and accessibility of affordable quality child care in creating their comprehensive economic development strategies. Job creation is an important part of economic development, but doing so without considering child care, is a barrier to many. For many communities, large and small, access to affordable child care remains one of the largest barriers to job recruitment. If people can't find quality and affordable care, they will not relocate to a region for a new job, no matter how good the job may be. A report from the Center for American Progress found that more than half of American households live in a child care desert. This is an especially big problem in smaller and rural communities where the rate of families in child care deserts grows to 3 in 5 households without adequate access to child care. In my congressional district, spanning most of rural southwestern Oregon, there is an enormous lack of affordable and safe child care. In fact, a recent study found that the child care market in my district can only meet the needs of roughly 1 in 4 children in the district, and many, many areas of my district are economically challenged. and people would have to commute long distances
Trying to do
to
a
get
blitz
gainful
here.
employment. And in my state, the average annual child care tuition for 2 children is $21,000. This isn't a problem, it's a crisis. The CED Act provides us a path forward by incorporating child care access into economic development plans. It allows communities to identify the needs and strategies and forces and integration of early childhood needs into broader economic development plans. I urge an aye vote. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. HR 8326 is going to ensure that recipients of EDA grants consider the availability of childcare in their comprehensive economic development strategies. I would urge my colleagues to support this bill, and with that, I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman for his brevity. The author of the bill, Representative Finkenauer, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Unmute.
Thank you, Chairman. Yep. Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the recognition, and thank you, Ranking Member Graves, as well. Economic development. Hard women with family
Abby,
enriched.
Abby, I guess you can't do that. I was going to say if you shut off your video, we could hear your audio, but then you'd be violating the rules. Okay, try and keep going.
All right. So obviously, as I said, childcare is economic development, and we can't grow our communities without childcare that is accessible and affordable for every hardworking man and women with children who need that care. Unfortunately, access to quality and affordable childcare is in short supply. This is well before the COVID-19 crisis, and the pandemic, has made it worse. Ignoring the need for childcare means we're limiting our community's economic potential, cutting short professional opportunity for parents and educational opportunity for kids. Democrats and Republicans alike recognize this problem because they can see it firsthand in their districts every day. So today, I thank you for considering the bipartisan Child Care is Economic Development Act of 2020, a bill I worked on with Congressman Jim Hagedorn from Minnesota. This bill will help include strategies to increase access to affordable, quality childcare and community economic development plans. And by doing this, we ensure that childcare is part of the plan for local economic development projects. We've already seen, especially in rural districts like mine, how a lack of quality care limits, sometimes as a mom or dad, turning down a promotion or even leaving the workforce altogether because it's actually more affordable to stay at home with the kids. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us just how dire the situation really is. We're facing crises even before the pandemic began, again, as I said, but now roughly 60% of childcare providers have closed their doors. And there's a chance that up to half of those closures will actually be permanent. Earlier this year, we passed legislation to create a $50 billion stabilization fund, which passed with bipartisan support and would actually help our child care centers get what they need and address some of the financial pressure facing our providers right now. But we all know this problem is obviously more complicated. We need additional solutions that go hand in hand with future economic development and an increased access in the long term. The Child Care is Economic Development Act of 2020 is a positive, bipartisan, and common sense step, and I encourage this committee's support, and thank you for your consideration. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady for her work on this. Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none, are there any amendments to HR 8326? Hearing none. The question is now on adoption, favorably reporting of HR 8326 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Our next item for consideration is HR 4611, the Ocean Pollution Reduction Act 2. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment is discharged from further consideration of HR 4611, and I call it the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Amendment nature substitute offered by Representative Napolitano, the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment, was filed. Does Chairwoman Napolitano wish to offer her amendment?
Yes, I have an amendment, the nature substitute at the desk.
The amendment nature substitute has been distributed electronically to members in accordance with the rules. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 4611, offered by Mrs. Napolitano, number 02.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. Chairwoman Napolitano is now recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment in the nature of substitute for H.R. 4611 makes several clarifying and technical changes to the bill identified since the bill was introduced. Again, the underlying bill, 4611, clarifies the procedures for the city of San Diego, California, to use the Standard Clean Water Act National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, NEPIDIS, permit process for continued operation of its Point Loma wastewater treatment plant. As I understand, HR 4611 is supported by surrounding cities, localities, Public Works Department, local water districts, and the local environmental organizations. Currently, the Point Loma wastewater treatment plant applies and receives a waiver under the Clean Water Act, and it operates with alternative standards. But due to land constraints, the facility is unable to treat its wastewater with full secondary treatment. To qualify for the waiver to discharge with less than full secondary treatment, the facility must meet certain criteria and reapply every 5 years. The Point Loma wastewater treatment facility is engaged in a long-term effort to reduce their discharges to coastal waters, and it will achieve discharge reductions by recycling and storing it for eventual use as drinking water. In doing so, the facility would redirect a portion of its discharge, but does not believe it will ever completely eliminate its discharges to coastal waters. However, to ensure that the city continues to make regular progress in improving the quality of water in San Diego region, HR 4611 includes several regulatory milestones for continued reduction in pollutants that must be achieved for the Point Loma facility to remain in compliance with the Clean Water Act. This legislation provides a path forward for allowing the city to address ongoing discharges through the Clean Water Act, while also providing the city with the ability to meet its long-term needs. This amendment in the nature of substitute does not substantively change the bill as introduced, but makes several technical and clarifying changes to ensure the bill executes properly and works within the framework of the Clean Water Act and the existing federal-state partnership in implementing that act. The committee has shared this language with the city and with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and will continue to refine this language as necessary as the bill moves forward for consideration on the House floor. I support the amendment and ask my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Do other members wish to be recognized? Oh, excuse me, Ranking Member Graves, do you wish to be recognized? Sam?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for that.
No problem.
HR 4611 aims to modify and simplify the City of San Diego's permitting process under the Clean Water Act to operate the city's Point Loma wastewater treatment plant. The bill also promotes increased water recycling and conservation efforts in the region, resulting in reduced treated wastewater discharges into the ocean. I would urge my colleagues to support this bill, and with that, I would yield back.
Do others wish to be recognized for statements on the bill? I support the bill. We will now consider the bill for amendment. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, is recognized for 5 minutes. The clerk will designate his current amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4611, offered by Mr. Graves, Louisiana, number 242.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, what this amendment does is rather than making a fix specifically for one water system, it would open this up to anyone around the country. Mr. Chairman, the reality is that oftentimes when we bring up environmental laws, whether it be Endangered Species Act or National Environmental Policy Act or the Clean Water Act and others, they become these sacrosanct things that folks say, look, we're not touching it, we're not going to do anything to it, they become radioactive. This very underlying bill recognizes the fact that trying to do a one-size-fits-all approach to environmental policy often doesn't work. And so, again, the amendment just says, don't just do the fix for California for one water system, let anybody have access to it. The point is, Mr. Chairman, is that in many cases, our very environmental laws end up undermining the protection of the environment. In my home state, as I somewhat referenced earlier, we've worked to restore our coastal wetlands, simply restore our coastal wetlands and the ecological productivity and function that goes along with that. We've had environmental laws that have prevented us from being able to restore, not build something that wasn't there before, simply restoring wetlands. That's it. Putting them back exactly as it was before because of Corps of Engineer actions causing us to have all of these coastal wetlands lost. And we've had environmental laws that have prevented us from doing it. The point is, let me say it again, Mr. Chairman, is that in many cases, these laws that folks are unwilling to revisit or provide flexibility to, in some cases, they undermine the very objective that they're supposed to be achieving. That could be through how an agency chooses to implement. It could be through the decades of jurisprudence that's resulted. But this amendment simply says that don't just do it for California, provide the flexibility to anyone who meets the criteria in the underlying bill. So that's what this amendment does.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none, then we will now move on to a vote on the amendment to the bill. Those in favor, what? What?
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent that the amendment be withdrawn. I simply wanted to make the point. My friend from California would kill me if I did this. I know, I see you. And I certainly don't intend to undermine the bill, but I want to make the point. I urge all of you, let's take a look at these laws in some cases where they're undermining the very objectives that they're supposed to be achieving. With that, again, I ask unanimous consent that Graves number 242 be withdrawn.
I thank gentlemen for withdrawing. Are there further amendments to the bill? Hearing none, we now move to final passage. Those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute signify by saying aye. 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 All those opposed by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. Question now on adoption favorable reporting of H.R. 4611 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill, as amended, is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. I believe the last item before the committee today, which hopefully will not be two more. Oh, two more. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 5919, National Children's Museum Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 5919. I call it the bill for consideration without objection. First reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open for amendment at any point. Amendment nature of substitute offered by Rep. Norton was filed. Does Rep. Norton, who also serves as Chair of Subcommittee on Highways and Transit, wish to offer amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5919, offered by Ms. Norton. Number one.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read and it shall be considered as base text for purposes of further amendment. Rep. Norton is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, for marking up the National Children's Museum Act My amendment in the nature of a substitute to this bipartisan bill would require the General Services Administration to enter into a cooperative agreement with the National Children's Museum, a congressionally designated museum, to allow the museum to remain in the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, a federally owned building in the nation's capital, without charge for the duration of its existing lease. There is precedent in Congress for authorizing GSA to enter into cooperative agreements to provide the use of a federal building in DC to a private museum without charge. The National Building Museum operates under such an agreement. This amendment would allow the National Children's Museum, the first combination children's museum and science center, to remain centrally located in the nation's capital for the benefit not only of this national capital region, but also of the millions who visit and live, the millions who visit here. Originally named the Capital Children's Museum, the National Children's Museum was a staple in the District of Columbia for decades. The institution opened in 1974 in a former convent on H Street Northeast. In 2003, Congress recognized the immense value in having a children's museum in the district and officially designated the museum as the National Children's Museum. Now the museum is bringing new and innovative STEAM, that is to say, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math exhibits to the nation's capital, building on more than 30 years of educating children and families. Importantly, this amendment relieves some of my concerns about the ability of the museum to survive the coronavirus pandemic. The museum immediately attracted many visitors from throughout the National Capital Region and the nation, but was forced by the pandemic to close 18 days later. At this time, the museum plans to remain closed until at least October 13th, 2020. When the museum does reopen, capacity will be restricted to at least 70% under social distancing guidelines, no more than that. Due to the anticipated reduction in capacity, the museum is estimating operating revenues will only amount to 30% of the original goal for next year. Once returned to full capacity, the museum expects to serve 500,000 visitors a year, filling the STEAM content void in our nation's capital. Despite its many benefits, the museum brings, it is still an outlier. It is the only congressionally designated museum expected to pay rent in a federal building. This bill would allow the museum to remain in its current federal location and allow staff to focus on bringing 21st century STEAM learning techniques to the nation's capital. I strongly urge my colleagues support this amendment, and I very much appreciate your taking up this amendment today, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady for advocacy. This has a tremendous merit. I ask unanimous consent to insert my statement in support in the record and without objection. And I would recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. HR 5919 directs GSA to provide rent relief for the National Children's Museum currently housed in the Federal Ronald Reagan Building in the International Trade Center, has been pointed out. This bill is going to provide the museum with similar relief afforded to other congressionally designated museums. And with that, I would urge my colleagues to support the bill.
Someone isn't here.
Yield back.
I now recognize Rep. Gonzalez Colon for 5 minutes. I don't see her. Okay, I guess Jennifer had to leave. Do others wish to be recognized for statements? Hearing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? Hearing none. If not, the question is on the amendment, nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those,
Aye.
all those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment, nature of substitute, is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption favorably reporting of H.R. 5919 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. The last item of business before the committee today is a General Services Administration Capital Investment Leasing Program resolutions en bloc. We will now consider 33 General Services Administration Capital Investment Leasing Program resolutions. I ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions en bloc and that they be considered as read and open to amendment in a point without objection. So ordered. We're considering 33 General Service Capital Investment Leasing Program resolutions today. 22 of the resolutions are for alterations to existing federal buildings and courthouses, some of which are in the districts of our T&I colleagues, such as Representative Norton, Representative Carson, Representative DeSaulnier, Representative Plaskett. 7 of the resolutions are for lease space for FEMA, the FAA, FBI, DOJ, DHS. 3 of the resolutions are for construction projects, the San Luis Land Port of Entry in Arizona, Calexico Land Port of Entry in Calexico, California, and DHS Consolidation, St. Elizabeth, Washington, D.C. I urge my colleagues to support these resolutions. I recognize ranking members for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Included in today's 33 GSA resolutions are projects that address critical repair needs for federal buildings, courthouses, including the Whitaker Courthouse in Kansas City, Missouri. Because of the space and rental rate reductions over the terms of the leases in this package, taxpayers are going to save more than $287 million. And I want to thank the subcommittee for their work on approving these prospectuses, and I would urge my colleagues to support these resolutions en bloc and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his brevity. I recognize Rep. Titus, Chair of the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management, for any statement she wished to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I turn to the resolutions that are up for consideration today, I want to raise an issue that is concerning me that has to do with the GSA and a troubling situation that's come up in recent months. I wrote to the GSA to inquire about 2 requests for proposal of major construction projects for federal courthouses. They included a peculiar stipulation mandating that the proposals had to adhere to a predetermined architectural style. GSA has not provided any other examples where the agency is predetermining designs of buildings beyond the adherence of the federal building standards, which has been the practice for many years. I find this to be a troubling trend that seems to try and bake into the outcomes what is supposed to be an open bidding process. It also seems to track a draft executive order that's been floating around since the beginning of the year that dictates a specific architectural style for all federal facilities. The United States has never had a mandated architectural style, which is something that is more common in authoritarian regimes. I introduced H.R. 7604, the Democracy in Design Act, which would codify the set of guiding principles that the GSA has used up until now for decades, allowing local talent, local styles, fitting with the local culture to go into the design of these federal buildings as opposed to one size fits all. The legislation was endorsed by the American Institute of Architects and says it reinforces our ideals of this country and our people to be reflected in all our federal buildings. Having said that, I hope that we'll work on that together because we don't need every building, every federal courthouse in the country, whether it's in Arizona or Massachusetts, to look like the Parthenon. We have 33 resolutions before us today, as you have both described, the majority of which are for alteration projects. These alterations are particularly important as they include modernization of fire and safety systems, upgrades to federal facilities to increase access for persons with disabilities, and other improvements to make the buildings safer and more secure. Every project before us today is viable, it's ready to go because it's either been authorized by the Senate, has funding already in place, or both. GSA specifically requested every single one of these projects as priorities for authorization. So I support these resolutions moving forward. I do want to say to my colleagues that we must be judicious in our approval of these resolutions so that we aren't in a situation where we're over authorizing or allowing GSA to sit on projects without a clear path to completion. I urge support of these 33 resolutions. I look forward to working with all of you on the architecture issue, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Hearing none, then there are amendments to the en bloc resolutions. Hearing none, the question is now on the adoption of 33 GSA resolutions en bloc. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The 33 resolutions are adopted. I ask unanimous consent that every bill reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of substitute, incorporating the amendments adopted without objection. So ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, conforming changes to each of the bills ordered to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chair or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, so offered. I ask unanimous consent that pursuant to Rule 11, Clause 2L, members have at least 2 calendar days to which to file supplemental minority additional dissenting views on legislation adopted today. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chair, after consultation with the ranking member, has the authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills offered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that cause the bills or concurrent resolutions to be subject to the budget rule PAYGO 21 point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes the presence of quorum for actions taken today on business today. Thanks for hanging in, everybody. With that, the Committee on Transportation has completed its business for the day, and the committee is adjourned.